Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to this morning's meeting of the Health Scrutiny Committee for Lincolnshire. So I'm going to start with agenda item 1, which is the election of chairman. Can I ask for any nominations, please? Lovely. So we have nominated Councillor Macy. Is there a seconder at all? That's seconded by Mackinson Sanders. Thank you very much. So it's proposed and seconded that Councillor Macy becomes chairman of the Health Scrutiny Committee for Lincolnshire for 24-25. All those in favour, please raise your hand. That is unanimous. Councillor Macy, would you like to take the chair? Thank you.
Well, good morning, and I would like to welcome everyone who is present in the chamber, including all one newly appointed district council members of the committee, Councillor Moira Wesley, who is attending her first meeting. I'd also like to thank Councillor Chris Burke for my proposal and Councillor Mackinson Saunders for my seconder. And I'd like to thank all members of this committee for your support. I look forward to working with you all in the coming year to ensure the best services as close to home as possible for the residents of our areas and Lincolnshire as a whole. I would also like to welcome those who are listening online to the Business of the Health Scrutiny Committee for Lincolnshire. The recording of the meeting remains on the Council's website after the meeting, and I would like to add, for those of us in the Council chamber, there is no fire drill planned this morning. In the event of the fire alarm sounding, we need to leave the Council chamber through the rear doors, through reception, and assemble in the car park at the front of the building and await further instructions. I would also like to request all members to place the phones on silent and to ensure everyone has the opportunity to ask a question, to ask a maximum of 2 questions per item, and to keep those succinct and concise. As the meeting is being streamed in the usual way, I would like to remind you that your comments will remain accessible online. I'd now like to move to agenda item 2, the election of vice chairman. I would like to nominate Councillor Linda Wotton for Vice Chairman, who has provided me excellent support as my Vice Chairman over the last 3 years. Do I have a seconder for that nomination? Councillor Smith, thank you. Any other nominations? No, in which case I'll put it to the vote. All in favour, please show. Thank you, that's supported unanimously. Welcome, come on up, Councillor Wotton. Thank you. In which case, I'll now like to move on to agenda item 3, apologies for absence and replacement members. I'll wait for you to get back, Jess. Bless you, running about.
Thank you, Chairman. We've received apologies from Councillors Lucille Higgs and Suzanne Welbury. We also have Councillor Jonathan Pessell replacing Councillor Higgs today, and we've also received an apology from Councillor Sue Woolley, the Executive Councillor for NHS Liaison, Integrated Care Systems, Registration and Coroners. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess, and welcome, Councillor Pessell. Okay, I'd like to now move to agenda item 4, declarations of members' interest. This is an opportunity for members of the committee to declare any pecuniary or other interests. Do members have any interest to declare? Councillor Kendrick.
Thanks, Chairman. My use of declaration, I'm a Governor of LPFT.
Thank you, Councillor Kendrick. That's noted down. Any further that come up throughout the meeting, please don't hesitate to raise and we'll record them at that time. We'll now move on to agenda item 5, the minutes from the 15th of May. This is to confirm these minutes as correct record, and they are found on pages 3 to 12 of the agenda pack. Councillor Cleaver has suggested an amendment to minute 96 GP provision along the lines, it was noted that 10% of GP practices in Lincolnshire were currently rated as requires improvement or inadequate compared to 5% nationally, and this would mean that 116,000 or 14% of the population of Lincolnshire were registered with a GP practice which is rated as either requires improvement or inadequate. So do we have any objections to that being accepted? No, in which case, do I have a proposer for the minutes then, please, with that amendment? Thank you, Councillor Kendrick. Seconded, Councillor Smith. All those in favour, please show. Okay, those against? And abstentions? Perfect, thank you. Okay, they are accepted. In which case, we'll now move on to agenda item 6, the Chairman's announcements. My announcements were circulated as part of the agenda, and my supplementary announcements were circulated on the 16th of July. Does anyone have any questions on the announcements, please? Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. Very briefly, with respect to item three, when I read this, it wasn't entirely clear. Is it now the case that the PICU for our male population is now open?
That's correct, Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. That's fantastic news, and it's been. I know it's wasn't a decision taken lightly, and a lot of hard work's been involved by all on our NHS colleagues. So well done to them, and it's fantastic that it's now open for our patients to use who need it most.
Thank you. Any other questions on the announcements? Councillor Mackinson-Saunders.
With the whooping cough, importance of the vaccination, is it possible to have some posters and things we could put up? Because I, as you know, I run a baby bank, and it would be quite useful to be able to put some publicity up to encourage mums to do what they should be doing.
I'm getting a nod from Sarah Jane, so yeah, I think we'll be fine. No problem. In which case, do I have a proposer that we note my announcements? Councillor Smith, seconded. Councillor Mackinson-Saunders. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. That's supported. In which case, we'll move straight into agenda item 7. Section 106, healthcare provision. This item was circulated as part of the agenda pack on pages 17 to 28. The committee has previously requested this item to develop an understanding of how NHS facilities can be provided with additional capital funding to mitigate the impact of housing development. I'd like to welcome our presenters from the NHS Lincolnshire Integrated Care Board, Sarah Jane Mills, Director of Primary Care and Community and Social Value, Sarah Starbuck, Head of Primary Care Commissioning and Development, and Emily Turk, Primary Care Support Officer for Commissioning and Development. If I can hand over to you just to briefly run through the pack, and then we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us to come and talk about Section 106. I know it's an item we touch on regularly when we come and talk about GP provision. I'm going to quickly hand over to Sarah Starbuck, who will highlight some key points from the report, but just to say that she has got a very bad cold and croaky voice, so if she loses her voice, I will pick up from her.
Thank you for the intro. Yes, so apologies, I'm a little bit croaky today, but I'll run you through the report. So within the report, you've got an overview in terms of the current process and the governance around Section 106, and I think it's evident that there's been a step change in the past few years in terms of how Section 106 has been managed by the NHS. So we have inherited the Section 106 process from NHS England. So that transferred over to us in late 2020, and within that we've significantly amended the process in terms of how we approach it. So we continue to work with our local practices, but also our primary care networks to make sure we are addressing their infrastructure needs. But I think what's helpful to note is that it works in conjunction with the draft primary care network estate strategies that have been developed over the past 2 years, but it also aligns to the ICS infrastructure strategy planning now. So it's looking at it in terms of population need and making sure we are identifying where we need to provide support to improve access and mitigate the impact of housing developments across the county. I think within the report as well, it's worth noting that, you know, we have a mixed arrangement in terms of primary care estates. We've got a mix of GP ownership and leased properties. So what we do is we are working with a multitude of tenants and landlords to make sure we're meeting their needs and making sure we're meeting the population needs. And added development of this has been the national introduction of Shape Atlas. So that's a strategic planning tool that's used nationally. It's been around for a number of years, but there's been an increased focus on that at national level from NHS England and also Department of Health and Treasury. So what it allows us to do is have that strategic planning tool that captures the health needs and is reflected in terms of our current estate, but also helps us plan for population growth, health inequalities, etc. So it's a far more robust process in terms of our assessment of where those health contributions are needed. I think it's worth noting that Emily has fantastic relationships with all the councils she works with. So Emily essentially works as having oversight of Section 106 on a daily basis. It's a busy space in terms of Section 106 processes, and Emily meets regularly with all the councils to ensure not only the governance is appropriate for the NHS but also the councils, but that we are reviewing the Section 106 as they become available and plan for future schemes that have been earmarked for future growth. I think it's worth noting it's been a really challenged position over the past few years, not only for NHS colleagues but also for developers. So where we are looking for third parties to support us to make use of those Section 106 funds, whether that's an expansion to a GP premise or improvement works to support the growth to the practice list size. It's really been challenging in terms of construction costs, inflationary pressures, and what we've done is we've in recent months taken some third-party professional advice to understand what that looks like in terms of increased construction costs, inflation considerations, because although we're looking at capital for Section 106, there is a longer term revenue consequence as well for the NHS in terms of rent reimbursement under the premises cost directions. So we see it in the round in terms of how we mitigate the risk, but also how we make sure the governance is there and the financial governance is there short term and longer term. So I think it's evident within the report that we've shared that you can see that actually the engagement has improved considerably with councils in terms of how we're working, how we're making sure we're drawing down the contributions. But I think as we, quite timely today with the King's Speech, when we're looking at housing growth and supporting that really needed housing growth in Lincolnshire, how we then strike the balance of ensuring we have the health contributions to mitigate the impact of that. So there is that balance to be struck of how we manage that going forward, as particularly as we're going to see increasing housing growth hopefully over the coming years, of developers quite understandably coming back to say it's a viability issue in terms of additional costs, for example, for health contributions. But I think it's really important to make sure we do strike that balance, and that's that partnership working with councils and NHS to make sure we plan for that for future projects. Sarah Jane, do you want to come in on anything?
No, thank you, Sarah. I think the bit that I would highlight is what we have here is an NHS with some very clear rules, and then a planning that has some very clear rules. And it is a bit of an art to actually make sure that we bring those together. And as Sarah has highlighted, as an ICB, we recognise the importance of doing this. So Emily spends most of her days working through this. I think the other thing that is important in terms of how we approach Section 106 needs to reflect the developments of healthcare provision and increasingly the range of access that people have to services. So when I came to talk about general practice, we talked about the fact that we've now got pharmacy first, for example. So increasingly, as we approach this, we aren't just approaching the development of the estate with a limited view of general practice, but increasingly looking at that population service need and, as Sarah's alluded to, primary care networks
which bring that extended community offer. I think it's probably best just to open up for questions because it is quite a technical, hence me bringing my colleagues with me.
Councillor Martin, I've got you first.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, good morning. Figure 3 on page 23 shows the tariffs, which currently, I presume that's the amount which we collect per dwelling with the resident multiplier, etc. Presumably that's based on single occupancy. I noticed South Kensington District Council says £606 per dwelling. This table says it was created in 2018. Is this a fluid table? Does it change each year? Or is that based on, sort of, you know, are we getting monies from 2018? Whereas 6 years later with inflation and such like, I mean, I did a quick calculation, £660 with inflation is now £834. So should we be asking the developers for an extra £174 per dwelling for each new build? And I read at the end it says this is being looked into. But if you think we've had 3,000 new builds in Lincolnshire last year, that equates to over £500,000. It's a lot of money, and it would obviously be good to know, is this going to get updated? And obviously, the sooner the better. Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of the formulas that are used, you're right, they haven't been updated for some time. So the formulas that are used, the multipliers and the funding per dwelling has been passed through, so that's the same values that we were took on from NHS England. As I said within the report, we have seen significant inflationary pressures, construction costs. You know, as I think I've put within the report, you're probably looking around 60% higher build cost really for any of the schemes we're currently looking at for primary care. So that's why we do need to take stock and account for that, because that's why we've taken independent advice to understand what the current construction inflationary pressures look like, because there's a balance to be struck of not being too punitive to developers in terms of being making it difficult for them to be able to develop in the area. We need additional housing, we need affordable housing, but at the same point we need to mitigate for that impact on local services, because particularly in many of the rural areas of Lincolnshire, patients won't have often a great deal of choice. We have practice boundaries that cover a large area, and there is an overlap to nearly all of them. But if in particularly large rural areas and coastal areas, it is likely wherever they are residing, they're going to be registered with the local practice. So it's how we mitigate that risk and plan for that accordingly. So that's the risk we've got at the moment, as it does take some time for the trigger points to be reached often for us to actually see the funding become available to draw down. So as we see, as inflation has increased in the interim, that has put a cost pressure on some of those schemes. So that's why we need to review now and take stock. And hopefully as the economy is stabilising, it allows us to then plan ahead and review whether that needs to be an annual process of just taking stock to making sure we are managing that and mitigating any risks.
Yeah, thank you for that. So just as a general idea, roughly how long do you think it would be before these numbers can be reassessed? Because I don't think the residents will be very pleased to find that developers are holding on to cash that we could have in our GP surgery.
Okay, so we took professional advice at the end of last year. We're also working with District Valuer's Office in terms of the increased cost, because it's District Valuers that assess value for money on any rent reimbursement for us. So there's a working in partnership, because the legislation requires us to do so. So we now have that. We are going to take it through shortly, so within a few months I would expect. So certainly we're scheduling to have that initial review at our next primary care estates group to review the process, so that will be September. and then we would put it through the ICB governance process. But also there needs to be consultation with the councils in relation to that, so it's not us working independently, so we need to make sure that dialogue is with all the councils, so we have an open, transparent conversation about what that looks like and the benefits, but also any risks that might present. So in progress.
Just following on from Councillor Martin's question, have you looked at building into that you actually have an inflation-linked price increase? Because the reality is you can come forward with this and you've got your new prices and inflation's gone up or down or whatever it may well be.
So at the moment we are, as all ICSs are across the country, we're working on an ICS infrastructure strategy that will be submitted at the end of this month to national team at NHS England. So that's in progress at the moment. The template that we're working to that is nationally produced by NHS England has that inflationary uplift. So within our planning for that, so any of the schemes we are putting forward as our priority schemes for new infrastructure for primary care estate and the rest of the health infrastructure, there is a prescribed inflationary uplift that is automatically applied for future years to mitigate that, just as you said.
Thank you. Okay, I've got Councillor Smith next, please.
Thank you. With your indulgence, Chairman, I have 2 points and 2 very brief questions, and I stress they are brief questions, Chairman. Chairman, as far as I can see, there are still 2 key issues with respect to Section 106. They are that there is a disconnect between the ICB and local GP practice, and what I mean by this, Chairman, is within the last 4 months or 3, we had an application at West Lindsey, where I am on the planning committee as a planning committee member in Welton, and the local practice said, if you keep building houses, we will have to take steps to basically lock our list down. National comes back, no, everything's hunky-dory. We as a planning committee have to go with the statutory consultee, which is not the practice. So we are having practices say, we can't, and they can't extend, Jem, because there's nowhere for them to extend. I know Welton very well. So we're having practices basically turn to them and say, we can't extend, we've got no room, we're struggling to get GPs, but we're being told another thing by the statutory consultancy. This disconnect, Jem's got to want a better word, that has to stop. The 2 of them have to get together and have an agreed position. All legislation needs, which I appreciate is not our either ours or our presenters' purview, needs to be altered in that regard, because at the minute that's a serious problem. The second one, Chairman, is obviously Section 106 can't magic GPs, and that's actually the biggest problem. Is there are too few GPs for the number of people who require GP services, and that is something Section 106 isn't going to solve. But one thing I will say, Chairman, is where in another application where they say the same thing 4 times of will extend the surgery, and there's nowhere for the surgery to extend, serious conversations need to be had between, you're saying extend the surgery, where? There's nowhere for it to extend to. You can't just say extend or make another consultation room when there physically isn't the space to do that. And there's this disconnect that really needs knocking on the head, because it's going to cause serious issues to residents. My very 2 brief questions, Chairman, are on the tariffs that have just been discussed by myself and others. When they are revised, could all councils at all levels, district and county, and indeed parish actually, because it will impact them, be notified of these revised levels and what they are going to be, because I think that's important, because that is something that actually a lot of parish councils and even a lot of district councils, we don't know what those levels are, because we don't see them. We see them here, but we just know, oh, well, they've got what they're entitled to. So, or it's from the Section 106 formula, which I know is very complicated. And thirdly, Chairman, could officers confirm that the trigger point not met, which states in the report, means that at the time of the report's writing, the trigger points of the developments that have already been passed basically haven't been reached for the Section 106 funding to be drawn down? It's not that the trigger point in this sense means that something has changed within ICB or primary practice planning, and so it's not been drawn down. It's a simple case of the number of houses trigger point hasn't been hit. So the money that are contained in the report for West Lindsey and all the other districts where it says that, it's still there to be drawn down at the appropriate time. It's just that it hasn't reached that yet. Thank you.
Poor old Sarah, with her voice, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, but just to give her a couple of minutes, you're absolutely right, Councillor Smith, in terms of the estate is one element of expanding service, but the workforce is a different element. In that context, that's why we've got the GP strategy and the wider work we're doing on the people plan to make sure that as we see population growth, that we do have the available workforce to support that. So you're absolutely right. I'll let Sarah come in on your other two questions.
Yeah, thank you. Very fair question. So in terms of perceived disconnect between GP practices and ICB, historically, bear in mind we were previously, this was previously managed by NHS England, then we were 4 CCGs, we've come together. So it's improved significantly. We've got a consistent process for the county. So we've got that equity now, which I think is an important factor. So we do have a number of practices that are landlocked, that you can't do anything in addition in terms of their current site. We do have that conversation with each practice in terms of what that scheme looked like. Obviously, some of the Section 106 applications were put in many years ago and things move on or expansions have happened in the interim. But some of this is how we have changed how we submit the bids to make sure we've got the flexibility to plan ahead. So should funding not be able to be drawn down for maybe another 5 years plus, we need to plan ahead of what will the landscape look like at that point in time. And some of that is, as we've said, it might be primary care network services and co-location of other services. So some of the elements within our infrastructure plan are hub working, because it's things like enhanced access at evenings and weekends and other services that can be provided at different locations to suit the patient. So we do work with that. We are well aware of the constraints of some of the sites, and that's looking at how do we still make sure we have the estate capacity to meet the needs of the population. I think in terms of the tariffs as well, as you mentioned, it wouldn't be our intention just, yes, we can certainly notify, but actually we'd like to engage and have that conversation with everyone who has an interest in that. So as part of the process, it wouldn't be us just determining what the tariffs are, it would be that engagement process around that. And trigger point not met. I don't know if Emily, you want to just confirm what that means in practice?
Yes, it means the fact of, the development has obviously got, say for like 100 dwellings, they've got to have, majority of them would be then 50 dwellings have to be occupied, and then that trigger point is met. So that's, yes, it's relating to how many dwellings have been built, but they've also got to be occupied.
But sorry, just to add, but the money doesn't go away. So the money is there in the bank. It's just that we can't draw it down until, as Emily said, the actual number of occupied housing has been achieved, and then we can draw it down, which means there is a delay in terms of people moving into housing and us actually being able to expand the estate.
Thank you for allowing me to come back, and that's what I thought it was, so thank you very much. On the point you've raised, Sarah, around the hub model, which does work when it's done well. The problem, has been alluded to, and I think it was you, Sarah Jane, that alluded to this, was that in a rural area, there often isn't that infrastructure. It literally is GP surgery or, oh, I've tried, I can't get in for 6 months. Oh dear, I now need to go to A&E because it's got so bad. And I've had that experience myself in where I am. There literally is GP and then it's, oh dear, you need here, because there isn't a step up from, in Lincolnshire, you have the centres you can walk into, etc. In my part of the world, we don't. It literally is general practice or, oh dear, I've waited 2 months, I'm now in a bit of trouble here, I have to go to A&E, which of course none of us want to do because we know the strain that puts on A&E, but when you're in pain, you don't have much choice. And I don't know how we get around that, because we're a rural area, it makes a hub model, yes, they work, but it makes it very difficult for you to do, because you need a concentration of populace to make it viable, funding-wise, but then for us as patients to use, because, as you said, you're trying to mitigate travel at that lower level of care. So I don't know how we go about doing that, and whether that's a conversation that we have here or between all councils, I don't know, but it's certainly something I think that needs, shall I say, thorough investigation of how we can get that to work, because rurally at the moment, it literally is a one-stop shop of general practice, or if you can't and you're in trouble, you go to A&E because you've got no option.
Again, I think that's a really, really important point, and what we're talking about here is creating a state to provide healthcare services, primary care healthcare services, alongside an ongoing conversation about how do we deliver the most effective healthcare services in the variation of communities we've got. What we do have is buildings that are fully occupied, as you say, from 8 o'clock in the mornings till 6 o'clock at night, and often into the early evenings, Monday to Friday. And some of this is about, okay, as we start to develop primary care networks and we start to develop a greater spectrum of services, how are we making sure that we're utilising those buildings to their fullest capacity? Now, that's not the same. I don't want my GP colleagues sort of like suddenly being really panicked, but that's not the same as necessarily a GP service or a GP practice, but often what we're trying to do is concentrate everything into those hours, where increasingly we've got capacity on a Saturday and Sunday that we could be using more creatively, that could create some of those space. So some of this, as the conversation goes forward, particularly in rural communities, is about how do we utilise those estates. And I can think of examples of how we have services that move around those rural areas over a period of time. So it is about us sometimes thinking a bit more creatively about how we deliver services, so we can work within what you're saying is absolutely right. The realities of the constraints that we've got, and that's a conversation we've got to have with the public. And it's also how do we encourage people that can to utilise the greater spectrum. So again, I come back to pharmacists as services that are available that can help the minor illness. That means that other people can get in when they need it.
Thank you. Councillor Burke next, please.
Thanks for that, Chair. Just around the issue of 106 monies not being forthcoming. So at Lincoln City Council Planning Committee the other day, against officer recommendation, we refused the planning committee because the 106 monies were being refused by the developer. Now, it was one of the calculated amount was £1 million, so we're not talking about small amounts, at least from my point of view. The interesting discussion that took place there was similar to the one that you've described. You know, we need to be careful not to reduce development by being punitive. The other piece of information I'd like to share is at the City Council, full council last night, it was reported on a number of developments at planning, and I am a member of the planning committee, I'll declare that. We have actually allowed 106 funding not to be paid. So now, whether we're now becoming braver in Lincoln is a possibility. We'll see whether or not the appeal succeeds, if they make one. But I'm sharing this because I'd actually kind of like planning committees across Lincolnshire to just start to think about how brave we might need to be. Do developers see Lincolnshire as a soft touch? And if they do, then you know, I'm sharing this for that reason. I also think that the other point that was made, that we need to be talking to members of Parliament and the new government about this, because I mean, I understand we're going to be expected to build 10,000 houses in the Lincoln area. I'm not complaining. I mean, there's a massive housing shortage, but that will make some of us probably make me unpopular at some stage. But so this is not going to go away. It's going to become more of an issue for us to deal with. Yeah, I just thought I'd share that. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Burke, and I think you've just beautifully illustrated why it's really important that we work as an integrated care system, and that there is that appreciation of We absolutely do need housing, and we need to support our local economy, which comes from that. But we do need to make sure the infrastructure is there. And as you've illustrated, it's about us all understanding that and being engaged appropriately in those conversations. So I think you've just beautifully illustrated why we need to be an integrated care system as opposed to health over here and planning over there. And that discussion and that shared planning is essential, as is the sort of like relationship that Emily has developed with the planning teams, because that gets that dialogue going in earlier days rather than it being a retrospective. So I think that's exactly what we should be doing.
Thanks for that, Sarah Jane. That's really helpful. I forgot to mention as well that there is another body which in this area is the Central Link Strategic Planning Committee, and similar committees are in all of our areas. I sit on that as well, so it's in my mind to repeat this small speech there. And those committees are quite powerful, Chair, because, I mean, recently we put through proposals for more solar panels and more, you know, where appropriate, heat pumps and this sort of thing. And that is now in force with district planning committees. So, I'm sharing, but thanks for that.
Thank you. Councillor Kendrick next, please.
Thanks, Chairman. Yes, I once sat on a planning committee of District Council prior to the integrated system that we now have, and I very much wish we'd had it back then. And one of the frustrations I recall was the fact that the lack of information and the lack of consultation that we received from the NHS, and it's encouraging to see that this has all changed now, and I can see a more integrated approach as being beneficial, and it's also given members here the opportunity to ask questions which we perhaps wouldn't have been able to ask without having had this report before us, so that's been very helpful. I've just got a couple of questions, and I apologise if I've missed it in the report. You talk about the ownership of GP practice buildings on the estate, and some are leased. What's the proportion of those that actually are GP owned and those that are leased, or the numbers out of all the practices in the county?
Okay, so in terms of owner-occupiers, 48 of our GP sites are owner-occupiers, 66 are leased to third-party landlords.
Thanks very much, Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Parkin next, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Many of my points have been captured by both Elder Smith and Elder Burke. What I was going to say was almost like a melee of the two. But I think fundamentally what we're looking at is the need for housing and the need for health obviously go together. And what we have lacked and what we do lack is a sense of strategy on both, with both of them running in parallel, in tandem. There is no doubt one of the absolute key determinants of health is housing. So it's not just about the amount of housing that we have, it's also about the kind of housing as well. And I think if we can get to a system where we are more integrated and we're not just looking at numbers and money and put it all together, then I think we could actually get a really powerful, I hate the word synergy, but I can't think of another word, but that's what the entire system needs, where we've got not just the health numbers dealt with in terms of people at the right surgery, but as I say, with those planning issues in terms of the surgeries being landlocked, but with health itself being as a key factor in keeping people well. So as much as a health issue, this is a public health issue and a preventative issue.
Thank you. Councillor Cleaver next, please.
Thank you, Chairman. and thank you for the report. It's very thorough and comprehensive. There's a couple of points. Again, forgive me if I should have picked these up from the report. My understanding is that GPs cannot access S106 directly because they're private businesses, and therefore they are precluded from actually putting in an application. So they're reliant upon the ICB to put in an application, which of course you do. And I think if you could confirm that that is in fact the case. My next question is, why is S106 only applied to GP-run services and not to things like urgent treatment centres, out-of-hours GP services, etc., which are funded directly through you, the ICB, and obviously are related to population growth as well. So if you have quite substantial planning housing developments proposed, which are looking about growing a town by 5 to 10%, you would expect the S106 monies to be shared between GP services and the provision or the extension of an urgent treatment centre for that town. So if you could explain why it's only GP practice specific, it would be interesting. I think there is, and I know it's something I want to speak about in these meetings, but one of the things that I think we all have in common in this room is we all suffer from a lack of public understanding of how these things work. And it's a constant bugbear for me as an elected member talking to people about planning applications. And thank you. That there is not enough public understanding of how S106 works. Constantly we hear whenever a planning application goes in for 200 or more houses, where's the GP services? Where's the school places? Where's GP services? And of course, people don't understand that the moment a patient registers with the GP service, ka-ching, the automatic capitation fee, so all of the revenue costs are already met to fund the new GPs. There's a lack of public understanding about that, lack of understanding about the fact that S106 money provides capital to expand premises and in some cases add additional buildings. So I think we all, none of us are doing a good job at making sure that the public understands how the system works. And we're also very guilty, I think, all of us, of not explaining how money's spent after it's been spent. And actually turning around and saying, there was £1 million given for this, and look, there's what it was spent on. And I think that's something we all as elected members and ICB, community comms specialists, could do to improve on. On the trigger point, is that set in stone? Is it not at the discretion of the local planning authority where the trigger point is on a particular development? Because logically, if you're building in future capacity, because you know there's going to be 2,000 people living on this new development, you've got to have the capacity ready for when the people are there. So logically, one would expect the trigger point to be the point at which the first house is occupied. So therefore, the buildings can commence and you're all ready there to go by the time extra people are already moving in. So I'm not sure whether there is any discretion, and it's down to the local planning authority to set when they do the planning conditions for the particular application that they're hearing. So if you could clarify that as well. Finally, there's one of the things I found very interesting with this is the comparison between how this works for school places and how this works for the NHS. And I think it's quite instructive to look at both, because the perception for me is that the school numbers, school places, works a lot more smoothly. It's a lot more clearer to understand. I suppose even though there's a linkage between the county council, who have responsibility for making sure there are enough school places, still have that legal responsibility, and academy schools over which they have little control. So there is a comparison there between NHS and independent GP-run services, but the education places seem to be a lot clearer. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on that. If there's anything you look at the schools and say, well, if we could do it that way, it would be a lot better. Because I think there seems to me, and I'd be interested to hear what you say, to be a lack of clarity about premises and who controls new premises and who commissions new premises between the GP and the ICB, because you clearly can perceive that X number of additional patients are going to move into this area. You have a legal requirement to make sure that they are dealt with as the ICB, but you seem to have no power to enforce any GP practice to take up those additional numbers. And that seems to me to be one of the loopholes or one of the shortcomings in the system as it stands at the moment. Whereas I think with school places, it seems to be a lot clearer. I think that covers all the points. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Sarah to come in on the issue of wider provision and the trigger point, but just in terms of the latter, I think describing this as forcing a GP practice is sort of like quite a difficult concept. A GP practice has a catchment area. And if somebody then chooses that they want to register with that GP practice, unless we have agreed with that practice for some unknown reason that they have got a closed list, then the patient is entitled to register with them as a practice. But as obviously was illustrated earlier, but some practices get to a point where they're exceeding their ability to meet that need, and therefore there is a dialogue that happens with that GP practice about how we support them. And there are a couple that I can think of in the centre of Lincoln where we have found ourselves in exactly that. And by working, again, as part of a broader system, and by broader system I mean with other parties in the Lincolnshire community, we have been able to be quite creative about looking at opportunity to re-provide practices. The one on Monks Road is a really, really good example of a practice that was really constrained. And actually through a very creative partnership with the co-op, utilising Section 106 money and national money, they have got a fantastic surgery now that meets their needs. So I do think sometimes it is about, we need to come at this from a innovative to look at how we can unlock that. But in terms of a GP practice, obviously, if a practice is challenged in terms of meeting patient need, that's an ongoing dialogue with us, irrespective of whether there is housing growth, because there can be lots of reasons. If their list is open, people can go and register with them. So I think that's quite important. I don't know about the education system. We can find out about that and see whether there's anything there. But in terms of wider provision and trigger point, I'll let Sarah answer those.
Okay, I'll work through these in order a little bit. So in terms of your, pardon me, my voice is now going. In terms of the why Section 106 relates to GP practices specifically, if you look at page 22 of the report, so Section 3, it kind of explains that the governance and the regulations that surround Section 106 is defined by where patients access healthcare. So it's only GP practices that have that defined registered list. So there are conversations happening nationally that may change in terms of how this is developed, and there's been consultations in recent months about the process and what this may look like longer term. But certainly as it stands at the moment, we work to that because it's defined for that registered population, and no other service has that registered population as such. So that's in short how it is in terms of working within the regulations. So so the trigger point, it varies a little bit. So it's agreed at the point of the application. So it is a difficulty for us that we see population increases for practice lists that have to be absorbed until that trigger point is met. But we try to have those conversations with both practices and the councils to make sure it's an appropriate trigger point. Emily, do you want to come in on that as well? Because there's some in recent days you've been dealing with, aren't there?
Yeah, so in relation to us as being as a standard consultee on applications, we do recommendations. We don't like approve or reject because that's not our position. So within our document that we send in, we recommend what the preferences are and where the money's spent. So our recommendation for the trigger point is usually generally 50% of the development or a phasing of a development depending on the size of that development, because we have been notified by the councils and developers that they're unlikely to accept a lower percentage, because they see you've got to have that population growth to then take on that extra burden.
Thank you. In which case, I've now got Councillor Mackinson-Saunders, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I was rather appalled to see that East Lindsey District Council gets the lowest amount of money per dwelling, given that we have rather large health needs on the East Coast. And I wondered what we could do about that. I was really disappointed to see that. We've had substantial new housing in Louth, in particular, because I know that better than some of the other market towns. And basically, I can't see any Section 106 monies going into anything. And there is an objection from the public that we are actually giving money from developers to private businesses. And that is a very, especially in the parish council, we are really against that, because why are we giving, it just seems wrong, doesn't it? But why, and we would need to change this with the government. I don't suppose they've had time and been able to talk about it, but it's a, I don't think we are addressing the problem correctly. And as Sarah said, it's important that we have the right sort of housing in places. We are getting loads of houses, and it doesn't matter about the infrastructure. And we, who have lived in these places most of our lives, you know, those practices are now full. There's, you know, oh yes, let's have more houses, let's have more houses. That's all very well, but we've got to make sure that we can't get GPs to come. So our services are diminishing all the time. And that, to me, is bad planning. And it just doesn't work. And I don't know why this can't be given to GP out of hours, because, and also to urgent care. And I know that's not in the rules, but I'm appalled back, because I didn't know it could just go to GPs. There was one development in Louth, and I know the money went to the marsh practice 6 miles away in Manby. That didn't help anybody in Louth. I could never understand that. So I hope this new system works better, but I will be asking at East Lindsey, one, why it's so poor, the amount of return that we get, and two, how we can improve you will decide where the money should go to, won't you? But how we can look at it in a more positive way, because I don't think it works for us.
Thank you. And I think this relates back to the point that I was saying earlier, that actually what we've got here is two quite strict rule frameworks that we have to operate within. And I think increasingly, and I do think this is a positive, increasingly there is a greater understanding from both parties about the constraints of those rules. And in that context then, there is a unified conversation that is happening in terms of how do we influence in our respective worlds, how do we influence to stimulate a different conversation. I don't disagree in terms of opening up the debate, and certainly with a number of councils we have talked about how do we be a bit more fluid in terms of where Section 106 monies go. And we've even talked about, you know, whether sometimes investing in buildings, whether that's the right solution, or whether we should be actually investing in technology or things like that. But we are operating in a framework where the rules are the rules. And what we need to do is I come back to the point Councillor Burke was making, this is about us working as an integrated care system to think about how do we unify and engage in conversations to, I suppose, reflect the fact that the way that healthcare is delivered is changing, and therefore we need other things to catch up with that. But it is the constraints that we're working in.
Mr. Chair, our MP was the health minister, and I just wondered if there was any point in feeding this back so she can feed it back to West Streeting, because these are really, really important issues for our residents. And if there's a way of feeding back so it gets into a system, so somebody 154 miles away from us in Whitehall can actually look at the situation again, because I think we'll all say we don't find this situation meets our needs. And I haven't even ventured onto the number of caravans we've got down the coast that we don't get paid for, which we should get paid for those people as well.
And I think just to add to that, I do think, I mean, West Streeting has been very clear in terms of his commitment to developing primary care and community services. So I think there is something about, if we can start to think about what would that look like, not just in terms of health provision, but the infrastructure. I think that's a really good idea about how do we provide that insight and feedback.
Thank you, Councillor Mackinson-Saunders. I think probably it would be better if we were going to do anything to go straight to probably West Streeting. I think in fairness, Victoria Atkins is obviously now not a member of the government per se, so I think we'll cut out that and probably go straight there and obviously ask that that's reflected. So if you
She will know the civil servants.
I'm certain she will, but I think we'll start off well and see where we go from that. So, but yeah, we'll certainly bear that in mind moving forward. Okay, I've got Councillor Pessol next, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of questions. In an age where we're increasingly moving to virtual, increasing IT-based resources and an integrated system where more work is being pushed onto pharmacists and other such bodies, do we need to look at, again, the way that the 106 money is shared out so it's not so GP-centric? Secondly, is there any provision in the 106 formula for looking at areas that have disproportionately high health deprivation indices or people with complex needs? Because I would imagine for those areas of the county with high retirement populations, there is an extra level of demand in terms of complex health, which would increase their need for extra cash. And just finally, do you have any comparative figures for other counties so that we could get an idea if Lincolnshire as a whole is getting the short end of the stick, as we seem to do on most other funding arrangements?
So I'll pick up your first point. I think this comes back to, we've touched on this a number of times, the framework for Section 106 is about the registered list and therefore currently does go to GP practices. I think increasingly we do need to open up the conversation around and work with councils to consider how we can look at the investment vis-a-vis meeting population need in that context, but currently that is the framework that we're working in. I'll let Sarah come in terms of whether we've got any benchmarking and whether there's any weighting in terms of demographics.
Thank you. So, yeah, and I think in terms of the other services, it's a very different environment for primary medical services, your GP services. We have that direct relationship because we reimburse the cost of the estate, which doesn't happen for the rest of primary care, such as pharmacy. So again, some of the constraints of the national structure, I understand the frustration. I think it's having those conversations nationally just to make sure we explore everything possible. In terms of the 106 applications that we submit, as I said, we use Shape Atlas, which is a tool that supports not only where the population need is for a particular, so that if it's a particular development, which practices are affected, we do look at areas of deprivation, additional need, because actually it supports our case to put forward in terms of where we are focusing that application. And obviously is going to, that's going to be a driver of the review that we will do in terms of the values and the metrics that we're using to put forward those for each of the areas. As you're saying, we've got variation across the councils at the moment. It's reviewing that to make sure it's as it should be and it's reflective of the needs and the challenges for each of those areas and the population. In terms of comparators, the way in which the ICB now works, particularly for core primary care, is that many of the functions we do, we work either as a Midlands level or specifically as an East Midlands level. So we've got very good working relationships with the five ICBs work collectively for East Midlands arrangements. So we meet as a minimum every 2 weeks and review primary care issues in the round, and that's sharing of knowledge, comparison, sharing of best practice. So estates is one of those areas. So just to give you assurance in terms of the way we're working, I think having, as we said, that equity for all of Lincolnshire, but also we can see how we benchmark against neighbouring ICB areas. So for us particularly, we work very, very well with the East Midlands areas. That's Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, Northants, Derbyshire.
If I could just briefly come back on that, please, Chairman. That's reassuring, but I was rather hoping that you might be able to provide us some comparative statistics in terms of where we rank as, say, in comparison to the larger urban centres, for example, such as Manchester, Birmingham, London, etc. That may not be possible today, but if that could be fed back at some point, that would be appreciated.
We can certainly look and see whether we can get any comparative information and provide that at a later date to via Simon.
Thank you.
Okay, I've only got one other speaker left, and then I'm going to close down the debate. Councillor Morgan, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for bringing this to our agenda. I know I asked for this some time ago. I am chair of South Stephen District Council Planning Committee, and I've been on the committee for about 13 years. So this has been a real issue. I think first of all, it's around the definition of sustainability, because certainly and I think it's been touched on by a number of our members, that there's a huge concern that we are developing more and more and more, but when we look at healthcare provision, is it actually sustainable in the true sense? And when you're making decisions on the planning committee, you have to weigh so many different things up. Actually, very often, healthcare ends up being bumped down the line, and it isn't actually a major consideration, whereas in fact, I know for the population, it is a very main concern. First of all, if I might, I know the answer to the question, if I may, that was raised, because I've done some of my own research, and also I am a former member of the East Midlands Council. The East Midlands itself as a region gets less funding than nearly any other part of the country. In fact, we compare to Wales per head of population. In fact, we're lower than Wales per head of population. To give you a direct example, in comparison to London, we get £1,000 per head less. So going back to that point, yes, we are the poor relation in the room when it comes to funding, unfortunately, and that's something obviously we would want to argue needs looking at. Definitely. One of the, I must admit, I'm quite shocked to see the big gap, and it's not just South Stephen, the amount of money is actually spent to the Section 106 bar what's available. I think one of the big issues we've got, and a lesson for the government really, councils don't build houses. we can only, unless we give them the funding to build council housing, we are totally dependent on the private sector to actually get on and build the houses. So we've got this catch-22 vicious circle. If they don't build the houses and meet their trigger points, we're absolutely stymied, and they're very good at just missing trigger points historically. One of the big issues we've got, I know, in the Grantham area, is we currently have in the pipeline, not developed yet, approximately 7,000 new homes. The occupation of those, we're going to be talking up to 20, maybe 20 plus thousand members of the public who'll be moving in, who will need our support. I think one of the big issues we've got is this 50% trigger point dictated by the developers. We know our GPs are working at maximum capacity and over. We know we've lost GPs in our areas. Therefore, is it actually reasonable to expect that these... So if I just take just one estate that's planned in my area, is it reasonable that we will have a new population of approximately 10,000 people before we get a single GP extra coming to the area? So this has a knock-on impact, and it's unfortunate because it builds a resistance in the local community to new development when we actually know we need more housing. So it's actually really, really important. The issue also we have is, I was talking to a very well-known landowner recently who is responsible for one of the big developments, and the discussion we were jointly having was, even if they go ahead and build the surgery, is there any guarantee a GP will come forward to actually occupy it? And that is a really big concern. And then I think just touching, because I think everyone's done a great job raising other points, I think we also need to improve the communications between the local planning departments and the ICB. I know I spoke to our lead planning officer, and they said that basically they very often don't get a response when they put in a request regarding what the health needs are, and I'm not sure why that's happening. And it'd be really helpful to make sure that we've got the right contacts, etc. Maybe people have changed, moved, etc. But that's obviously concerning. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pick up the latter. I'm not quite sure why that is the case, and it'd be really helpful if you could provide us the feedback of the individual, because, as I say, Emily spends almost every day linking in with the different departments, and over the last couple of years in terms of our response, because previously there was a framework where health didn't respond unless the housing was a particular size. We're now responding for anything over 10 houses. So if we can get that feedback. And then I'll let Sarah come in on some of the other points.
Thank you. So in terms of response, yes, please come back to me directly. We have a generic mailbox that's purely dedicated to Section 106, so everything should be coming through there. If not, they can escalate through to me. And as I said, Emily's dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, so I'd be interested to know. Emily links in with each of the councils in terms of the applications themselves, and both myself and one of our directors, Jackie Bunce, link in terms of any escalations or broad conversations around some of the planning issues. And we did meet with SKDC not that long ago in terms of some of the improvements we can make and assurances around governance processes. So I'd be interested to get a bit more detail from you, please. So in terms of some of the comparators, as I said, we'll provide some information following the committee, but I think certainly we do need to look at how we reflect the need for Lincolnshire as a county. It's challenging, particularly with different land values, construction costs, and they vary across the country in terms of what we can submit in terms of a reasonable request. But I think I agree with you, trigger points are a challenge, and many developers sometimes don't even reach that, and then you see the population increase for services in the area. So that certainly is a challenge, and welcome further discussions.
I've just received a message from one of my residents. It said, tried to use surgery contact page in the NHS app at precisely 8 o'clock. couldn't as it was not available, which sums up what everybody's telling us.
Okay, thank you. In which case, I've got two questions before I move to a proposal. So my first question, I think we've skirted around this somewhat, is has there ever been any attempts by either the ICB or NHS England to alter the expected use of this type of funding so as to allow for Section 106 monies to be spent on staffing costs? As clearly infrastructure is important, but without additional staff, these expansions may not be needed in the first place.
I'm not aware that there has, Councillor Macy. The Section 106 is very much about the capital and linked to the building development. As I think, I'm not sure whether it's Councillor Burke or Councillor Cleveland, once somebody registers with a practice, that triggers the revenue flow into practices and the allocation that the Lincolnshire community receives.
Thank you. And then following on from that, if you had the power to make changes to the Section 106 process, what changes would you make?
Oh, how long have we got? Well, I'll bring Sarah and Emily in. I think for me, I think the point that Councillor Morgan raised earlier, I'm not sure that it's always about the Section 106, although I think the opportunity for us to open up the discussion around investment in the infrastructure more broadly that would help us deliver primary care services to reflect the new models and the new way of working is probably the main thing. I would suggest that the important thing is, as we touched on earlier, that increasingly as an integrated care system, we need to have more and more joined up conversation about the importance of good healthcare linked to good housing, and that it isn't at the end of the considerations and perhaps higher up in the considerations and discussions with planning committees. That would be, from my perspective, something that would be very, very positive.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think we are at a position now where we've got the opportunities to change the way we share information, engage with each other on a Lincolnshire level. So I think that's the opportunity we are grasping, and we have to continue to do so. I think in terms of how we highlight this at a national level, as I said, there have been some consultations at national level in recent months and review of how the process works and the wider infrastructure, levies, etc. So what I'd like to see is there's a pace and an urgency from that at national level, and an understanding of the particular challenges for rural counties in terms of, because I think there is a huge difference in terms of some of the more urban areas and what works well there, but also we need to factor that in with rural areas, high levels of deprivation, transport infrastructure and other things that certainly impact and have to be seen in parallel when we look at our planning needs for a state.
And I think just to add on that, when we say at a national level, one of the issues that is highlighted very much with colleagues in NHS England, particularly around primary care, is state is one of the biggest constraints and one of the biggest concerns that GPs highlight. And so there is this very active conversation that is ongoing, but anything we can do to influence that across the system would be very positive.
Okay, thank you. In which case I'm going to move to the proposal. I'd like to propose that we thank the presenters for the comprehensive report and presentation, that we support all efforts by the NHS in Lincolnshire to secure as much funding as possible to mitigate the impacts of new housing development and population growth in the county, and that I write to the Secretary of State on behalf of the committee raising the concerns expressed in the debate. Do I have a second for my proposal, Councillor Morgan? Thank you. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. That's supported unanimously. Okay, thank you very much. We'll now move on to agenda item 8, NHS decision on hospital services in Grimsby and Scunthorpe. This item was circulated as part of the agenda pack on pages 29 to 47. since the issue of the agenda, and I can confirm that the NHS Humber and North Yorkshire ICB approved the recommendations as set out on pages 34 at their board meeting on the 10th of July. I'll hand over to Simon, and then I just briefly want to say something after that, and then I'll open it to the floor. Simon.
Thank you, Chairman. So just turning to pages 29 onwards in relation to this item, the proposals for changes, excuse me, the hospitals in Grimsby and Scunthorpe were consulted on last autumn and just into the beginning of this year by the Humber and North Yorkshire Integrated Care Board, and this committee provided its response to that, which was, I suppose to sum it up, didn't really support the proposals. So those proposals are just sort of outlined on page 30. A joint committee was also established last autumn, and they also prepared a response to the proposals. The workings of the joint committee are just briefly referenced on pages 34 and 35. I think the committee's attention needs to focus, if I may, on pages 32 and the table on page 32, where we have the service area set out in one column. We've got the original proposal, which is the one that was consulted on, in the middle column, and then the revised proposal in the right-hand column. And obviously there are some changes, but there are key differences. One of those, for example, is the consolidation of ophthalmology services at Hull Royal Infirmary, and this was not, as I said, not included in the consultation. One of the changes that obviously they're not bringing forward is the change to gynecology, where they were going to consolidate at the Grimsby site, but that will now continue, perhaps for the time being, in both Scunthorpe and Grimsby. And then the urology, which is consolidating at Scunthorpe, although that was something that has temporarily been operating at Scunthorpe for a number of years. So the changes to the way forward, the changes, just to make clear, the ICB last week approved the revised proposals. So those are the proposals that they approved, some changes to the original proposals. I attached to the report a section from the decision-making business case, a chapter which is on transport and travel, and I included that. There are a number of other chapters, but I thought I would include that because this is one of the areas that the committee raised major concerns in its response last autumn, that there would be impacts on the local area. So I've put that forward for the committee's information. There may be questions today, and we don't have anyone from the ICB present, so it's really just the information that I'm presenting to the committee. So I can try and answer questions, but I'll see how I get on with that. But yes, thank you. I hope I've made it as clear as possible, particularly for the new members of the committee who have joined in the last month or two. Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I have to say, having read through the revised service changes, I have to say how incredibly disappointed I am, as NHS Humber and North Yorkshire ICB seemingly have not taken any notice of those issues that this committee raised through its response to the consultation. Nor has the ICB taken notice of what the three members from this authority put forward for the Joint Health Overview and Scrutiny Committee. In fact, what we have now is some services, as Simon's alluded to, such as ophthalmology, moving away from Scunthorpe and Grimsby and up to Hull. We also have a transport plan that pays no attention to the Lincolnshire residents who will struggle to travel further across Greater Lincolnshire with poor transport links and high levels of deprivation. Furthermore, no representative from the NHS Lincolnshire ICB board sat on the working group for travel and transport, and advising mitigation will take place via a scheme of Humber voluntary car drivers, which is not on offer in our part of Lincolnshire, meaning greater difficulty in repatriating patients home. I also feel the Humber and North Yorkshire's ICB's engagement was not satisfactory for the residents in our part of Lincolnshire, as they feel that they were not properly consulted or able to express a view. I therefore feel that our best option is to now test the new system of requesting the Secretary of State to intervene and review these proposals. But I'll open it to the floor now. I've got Councillor Morgan first, please.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I think you've just you've just said a number of the comments I was going to make. I think in particular there was the concern that we raised regarding the impact on our acute care, our A&E services. To see that they've just taken no notice of that whatsoever it's not only massively disappointed, it could be life-threatening. We have to bear that in mind. We already know there's an issue, especially where people who are vulnerable have to travel long distances, of them actually not taking the journeys even and choosing to stay at home. So we could be talking about lives at risk because of this decision. The other area I'd like to touch on, and you mentioned the mitigation around transport. You've partly answered a query I was going to ask. But as we know, we have had enough issues within changes within our own area to know that there are big gaps anyway in that, and that especially at night time, will they be providing 24/7 transport? I doubt it very much. So we've now got people, particularly on the East Coast, who will be having to somehow get back from you know, it's just absolutely ridiculous, from Grimsby at night all the way down to wherever they have to go, at a horrendous cost of them to use taxi. They simply won't be able to do it, and won't be, and it just really makes you wonder how viable this is. I think that I wonder if there's cause to consider the Equalities Act, because so many people with protected characteristics will be directly affected by this decision in our area, whose needs have not been taken into account or planned for. Just to make that point.
Thank you, Councillor Morgan. I've got Councillor Parkin next, please.
I cannot express my anger and frustration more on this, because at first I thought the mood music from them was very constructive and open in terms of their initial presentations from us. And it's not just me, I think we've ignored. Us, I think we've ignored. I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen an example where decisions have been made beforehand, or even worse, on the hoof. And I'm not sure which is worse. And as I'm sure Jill agrees with me, that as somebody who is from Louth and whose residents absolutely depend on these services, it fills you with dread, quite frankly, in terms of the knock-on impact to our absolutely overstretched GP services and our acute care, because that's where this is going to fall. That's where this will fall. It will also fall on mental health services and reduce mental health, because we know that all of these things, when you cannot get your health needs met, I don't know. It's no wonder people get disheartened and discouraged, and you can't, with leaving party politics aside, you cannot look at issues with a previous government, because what we've actually got here is poor, sorry to be open, you've got poor decision making, and that's nothing to do with central government and their mishaps. That this is just poor local strategic planning. It's poor consultation, and there's just no listening. There's no, I don't know, Joe, I don't know if you've got anything more to say, but I despair at it, I really do.
Yeah, fully agree with you. I think Councillor Smith's coming in next, and I'm sure that he'll say for his side as well of Lincolnshire, it's obviously a major concern. But Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. I, as you, was sat for those meetings, and I will put on record I'm frankly furious that the Joint Committee was not re-stood up for this. That was not what we were consulted on at all. And I also agree with I'm going to expand on Councillor Morgan's point of view. Not only are there protected characteristics under the Equalities Act, through your recommendation, Chairman, which I am more than happy to second, they failed totally in their legal duty of due regard to those who are veterans and armed forces community, which is a legal duty they have to fulfil because they were not consulted on until after the first meeting, when myself and another councillor raised the point they hadn't been consulted on at all until then. And then the consultation exercise for that group and our residents of Lincolnshire was, quite frankly, Chairman, done on the back of a fag packet because we hadn't been consulted. They didn't even factor in that our residents deserve to be consulted on, which frankly is appalling, when actually our residents outside of Scunthorpe themselves were the second most, and Grimsby were the second most impacted residents, yet they were having more consultation in Hull than our residents had, and their hospital was hardly being impacted. You've touched on two of the points, Chairman, I was going to make around ophthalmology going to Hull and transport, which frankly is, if you can't get yourself home and if you're discharged at 3 in the morning, you're stranded in Scunthorpe or Grimsby if you can't get somebody to get you until the following day. And what do they expect that person to do who they've just discharged, who probably isn't still very well, who certainly won't have their wallet? You know, if you're ill, you don't think, oh, I'll need my wallet on me in case I need to go and put myself up for the night because I've been discharged at 3 in the morning. It's farcical. The whole thing, Chairman, from start to finish, has been a farce. And in some respects, my residents almost, in a lot of ways, they're lucky because a lot of the services are in Grimsby, and a lot of my residents, that's where if they need services outside of Lincoln, that's where they will go. So in some respects, they're quite fortunate if they can get there, and if they can get back, big if. The problem is when you go to the other side of West Lindsey, so the residents of Gainsborough, and other areas on the western side, and a lot of people in Gainsborough don't have, much like in other areas of deprivation, don't have the luxury of their own motor vehicle. They're completely hamstrung. They can't get visitors when they're in hospital for an extended time, which we all know is proven to actually increase your well-being when you're in hospital for an extended period of time. That this is appalling, as has been said. They weren't interested in listening. The decision had been made before we even sat as a joint committee. They'd made their determination. And to me, that's not acceptable. If you made a determination, what was the committee stood up for? Just say, we've made the decision, there you go. I absolutely endorse your call, Chairman, to test the new system, and any support I can provide, I'm more than happy to do so. I would also suggest, whilst we do that, we also write to all our members of Parliament and the Health Minister to register, quite frankly, the disgust of how it's been handled and what's gone on, because I think if they're not aware, our MPs need to be aware of how this has been handled in Lincolnshire, and I suggest our colleagues in North and North East Lincolnshire gently do the same as well, because I don't think they've been particularly served either. And I suspect, Chairman, as we said before this report came, I suspect we will be stood up again shortly at some point within the next 2 to 3 years for the same problem. And it's very much a patchwork quilt of trying to patch holes that are going to reopen again very quickly.
Thank you, Councillor Smith. As I think you'll see within the papers, obstetrics is going to be what they're going to be reviewing next, and that could more than likely change the where maternity moves to, and that's a very big concern if we're on the East Coast, and I'm sure over to the West as well. So yeah, I think we need to put this marker down really now and ensure that we don't feel it's acceptable. The fact that Hull was involved at all in the process still baffles me, because absolutely no alterations or effect has been had or will be had on the residents of Hull. So the JHOSC has been something that I think also needs questioning moving forward. So I've got Councillor Mackinson-Saunders. Did you want to come in?
Yes, please. Well, I completely agree. People in our neck of the woods don't have a choice of where they go. You go where the ambulance takes you, and then you have to get home again. If you need a car service, you have to pay up front for that, and a lot of vulnerable people don't have £75. They can just magic like that to pay for a vehicle to take them to hospital appointments. It's his consultation. What consultation? It doesn't work. Actually, somebody who's a governor on the Grimsby, up at Grimsby, told me this was all about Hull in any case. And, you know, that is not good enough for our residents. And this, you know, I despair. I'm like everybody else. It's not the answer. to our health needs, is it? And it's one thing being in Louth and we can just go up the A16, but if I lived towards Mablethorpe or Chapel St Leonard's or somewhere, I would really be really worried about this. It just doesn't work.
Okay, I've got no other speakers, so I'm going to move to an official proposal. So I'd like to move that the committee's disappointment with the decision of the NHS Humber and North Yorkshire's Integrated Care Board on the consultation entitled Your Health, Your Care, Let's Get Better Hospital Care can be recorded. That the committee requests the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care to intervene in the proposed reconfiguration of services at Scunthorpe General Hospital and Diana Princess of Wales Hospital, Grimsby, using one or both of the following grounds. A, there are concerns with the process that has been followed by the NHS commissioning body, and or a decision has been made and there are concerns that a proposal is not in the best interest of the health services in the area. Do I have a seconder for my proposal? Councillor Smith. Thank you. All those in favour, please show. That's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you all very much for that. In which case, we'll now move on to agenda item 9, the Manthorpe Unit Grantham Extended Temporary Closure for Enhanced Dementia Team Pilot. This item was circulated as part of the agenda pack, and you can find it on pages 49 to 57. The Enhanced Dementia Home Treatment Pilot has been considered by the committee regularly over the last 3 years. This report refers to the likelihood of changes to the service provision as a result of the pilot, and I would like to welcome our members on Teams presenting. I have Sarah Connery, Chief Executive of Lincolnshire Partnership NHS Foundation Trust, and Jackie Tyson, Business Manager for the Older People and Frailty Services Division also. I'll hand over to you for the presentation and questions at the end, if that's okay. Thank you.
Many thanks, Chair, and thank you, colleagues, for inviting us back into the meeting today. As you have mentioned, this is really sort of an update on where we are in the process, as we have presented to the committee before. But just to bring everybody up to speed for the context, and we will assume that the paper is read. Manthorpe Ward is an 18-bedded ward in Grantham, caring for older people with complex dementia needs. And just to reiterate that prior to the temporary closure, this was a county-wide service. So it's not just that people from Grantham and the surrounding areas would have been admitted to that ward if they had that need. It would have been on bed availability and presenting need at the time. So we took the difficult decision to close Manthorpe Ward temporarily back in April 2020 as part of the Trust's emergency response to managing the impact of COVID-19 on staffing levels. The staff from the ward at that point redeployed to support the remaining dementia ward in Lincoln at the Witham Court site, and also to enhance the community offer in the initial stages of the pandemic to make sure that we had 7-day service and reduce the need for admission to hospital, as we want to keep people in their homes receiving care in their communities as much as we possibly can. During this period then, the United Lincolnshire Hospitals Trust made the decision to turn the Grantham site into a COVID green site, which meant that all of our LPRT services needed to be located elsewhere during this period. So during that time, the Trust has decided to pilot the dementia home treatment team, which continue to minimise the need for hospital admissions for this very vulnerable patient group. We have done considerable engagement through this process, and indeed continue to do so as well. And I'm joined here by my colleague Jackie Tyson, who's led a number of those engagement events to be able to sort of talk about the themes that are coming up. So I'll hand over to Jackie in a moment. Just to say that the feedback that we're receiving so far has been really positive. Obviously, there's always lessons that we can learn in terms of the care that we provide and make positive changes to services for people. The next steps in the process as we continue the engagement is to engage with an independent clinical review, which is being undertaken by our East Midlands Clinical Senate, and that process is ongoing now. It will then report its findings so that we can agree our next steps and bring that back to the committee in terms of the options to move forward with the dementia home treatment team and considerations on the Manthorpe ward itself going forward. So in terms of the actions requested, the committee is asked to note the report on the continued pilot of dementia home treatment team, taking into account continuous public engagement, carried on, and then expect a further updates, probably September or October, in terms of the outcome of that. But if I just hand to Jackie just to give an update in terms of the themes that are coming through from the engagement events, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody. So our recent engagement process started in May of this year, and we've now completed 17 separate events. Our learning in the older adult division has been that people living with dementia and their carers find it very difficult to access large events. So as well as doing a virtual event and a face-to-face public event, including one in Grantham, we've targeted dementia support groups and have physically gone out to those groups to engage with the local population experiencing living with dementia. Overall, the general feedback has been very positive. We've had a lot of comments, people saying they wish this service had been available sooner. So very positive responses. Some of the learning we're going to take back is not isolated to LPFT, and we'll be sharing with our Dementia Transformation Programme lead to take back to the wider system. Some of this feedback has been around sharing of information, how we cascade out what support is available across the system. Post-diagnostic support in particular is a theme that's come up. We're hoping some of this might be addressed in the newly to be launched dementia strategy, but part of that has included discussions about the operational hours of the dementia home treatment team and lack of crisis support in dementia, and these are ongoing discussions. We're currently reviewing whether a slightly different offering in the summer would be appropriate, as we know that people living with dementia, their behaviour can change as the light changes, so whether we need to extend our hours during the summer period. Some of the other feedback has been around more practical support for carers looking after people with dementia. We know there's some good signposting support out there, but perhaps thinking about more practical support. And again, we're hopeful that the dementia strategy will address some of this. And finally, some feedback around the lack of training within some care homes, that the dementia home treatment team are highly specialist and have been giving training into care homes, but perhaps we could consider how we expand that offer. But as I say, overall, really positive feedback for us to continue working in this way.
Thank you, Jackie. And just to reiterate before I hand back to you, Chair, that the inpatient offer still remains for anybody who requires that more inpatient focused support. And since the start of the pilot, we have had no out of area admissions at all for older adults. So that's really positive, and that would indicate that the capacity that we've got in county at present is adequate and sufficient for needs. I also want to say that something that's come through is around potentially the additional travel that might be required for carers, for example, to visit loved ones while they are receiving inpatient care, and that support is available from the Trust if required. So yeah, hand back over to you, Chair. Happy to take any comments or questions, and happy to come back potentially October, November with a further update. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Kendrick first, please.
Thanks very much, Chairman. Yes, I know that a lot of work's gone into this. Just a couple of quick questions, and I think that the first one was touched on in regards summertime, but I was just wondering about out of hours support for people, because obviously healthcare is sort of a 24/7 thing. Secondly, the dementia strategy has been mentioned, and I would expect that perhaps we'll get some update on that when you come back to us later in the year. And finally, what sort of element of respite care is built into this new approach? Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. So yes, in terms of the dementia strategy, so obviously the election has slowed everything down slightly in terms of getting certain approvals through. So that's definitely one that we will be bringing back. In terms of the out of hours, as Jackie said, some of the feedback that we've had is around that crisis. So we are reviewing what those gaps are and what that potential requirement might look like. In terms of out of hours support, we now have NHS 111 option 2, which is open to all. We've had a soft launch from April, but that's all age offer. And that will be pushed nationally as well in the autumn time. So that is one area of support that people can access out of hours. That's 24/7. As 111 is for all other services. Did you want to speak a little bit about respite, Jackie, in terms of anything that's come through the engagement?
Yes, absolutely. There was quite a few comments about difficulties for carers accessing respite, and obviously that's not within the DHTT remit, it's not within their gift. They do, however, support with transitions between placements. That's a large part of the work they do and has been really well received. I think access to respite is again one of those wider system discussions that needs to be had. And just to advise that with the 111 option 2 service, the division did provide some additional training to the staff in that service so that they had some specific training around dementia and the types of calls that they might get.
Thanks, Chairman. If we could perhaps have an update on what's happening with regards to respite when colleagues come back to us later in the year, I think that'd be useful. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Kendrick. We'll certainly pick up on that. Councillor Morgan next, please.
Thank you. I think the trouble with the consultation, especially where you're moving services away from one area, is bound to have perhaps more of an impact on, as we've just been discussing actually, on those who might have been closer to where the original service was being provided. I'm slightly concerned around the figures quoted on page 52 because, again, if we change our criteria for admissions, which is basically what we're being told, it's difficult to compare what we had readmissions in the past with what the actual level of need really is, because we've changed the criteria. And we had that with maternity services. So I think we just have to look at what we've got on the feedback we're getting. It seems to be generally very positive because dementia patients do want to ideally be treated at home. I am concerned about the out of hours. We talk about option 2 on 111. What exactly is that? I noticed that there is a request referred to on page 53 if people can self-refer. And it's not clear whether they're talking about self-refer to the service overall, or whether they're saying if I've got a crisis and we think we need to put somebody, take them into hospital, if that's what they're talking about. So I just wonder what the actual process is, if necessary, when there is a crisis, to get somebody from home into one of those wards, if it's necessary.
Thank you. Shall I pick up to start with, Jackie, and then you might want to come in as well. But I think that is the key gap that we have at the minute. So we don't have a bespoke dementia crisis service. We do have services such as mental health liaison in the hospitals, which are all age, but particularly for dementia crisis, that is one of those gaps that is being picked up through the consultation period. So in terms of the 111 offer that it is at the minute, so if people just ring 111 and if it's seen as a mental health issue, then they will press option 2, and then it will be sort of a hot handover, warm handover in terms of linking up to other support services that are available in the county. But dementia crisis is not something that we currently are commissioned to provide. So Jackie, I don't know if you want to add anything further to that.
Even prior to the Manthorpe temporary closure, the lack of crisis support in dementia was something that was being discussed, and hence when the NHS 111 option 2 option became available, we ensured that those staff did have some skill sets to deal with calls from people experiencing issues with dementia. Currently, the referral process is via SPA to CMHT, who act sort of as the gatekeepers into DHTT. They're not a crisis service. Their remit is to try and speed up discharge and to also prevent admission, so that they are not a crisis service. That being said, they do respond to urgent cases as needed, and have always done that. It's always been patient need led.
Sorry, can I can we just clarify then how do patients get admitted if necessary into a ward? Forgive me, you mentioned SPA. I'm not sure, that might be different. Is it through GP? How is it actually done?
Yep, so generally speaking, SPA is the single point of access telephone number. Our community mental health teams would be reviewing that person, and if they felt their needs were escalating and could not be met by the dementia home treatment team, then admission would be arranged. Referrals to our community mental health teams are received directly from GPs or our colleagues in A&E. The dementia home treatment team can input into A&E and inpatient wards in our acute settings and support those teams to try and speed up discharge and assess whether actually an admission into our dementia assessment unit is required. So the dementia home treatment team can also assess if they feel that this person is not responding to their interventions and needs more input, then an admission to Langworth ward, which is at Witham Court, would be agreed. In a sense, the referral process hasn't changed. We've added a step, we've added an intervention, which is the dementia home treatment team, to try and avoid that hospital admission and support the person in familiar surroundings. So it's almost enhanced the inpatient service.
Thank you.
Councillor Mackinson-Saunders.
There does seem to be a bit of a chasm in some of this, because how does somebody who's dealing with a husband or wife that's got dementia actually know that this is what they can do? Because I've been dealing with somebody recently, and he poor fellow was run ragged with a wife with dementia, didn't know where a lot of these things were available, and there's a huge amount of guilt that goes with this about then saying, at what point does somebody go into a home and so forth. So I'm not blaming anybody because I'm sure a lot of the work that's going on around dementia is really good and it's moving on apace. But I do think it's getting the message out to people is the crucial bit, because there tend to be more elderly people who are caring for elderly people, and that is, they just don't know what is available a lot of the time.
Thank you. I'll pick that one up if you like, Jackie. I don't disagree, Councillor. I think we do sometimes have some fragmented services on offer. Everyone's trying to do the best with what they have, and that's why the dementia strategy is so important, because it's about making sure that our services are accessible and communicated in a way which will work for people across the whole of Lincolnshire going forward. So we're really excited about it. And it's not just about what's happening in healthcare services like in Lincolnshire Partnership. You know, we're doing it in partnership with the County Council, with Age UK, with Alzheimer's, lots of VCSFE partners who are part of the rich tapestry of service provision in Lincolnshire. But one of the key aims is to make sure that people can get that support. It's clear, it's accessible, preferably in people's homes, which is what the dementia home treatment team is all about. I hope that's helpful.
So how does somebody who lives alone cope? Because that is something that mystifies me. So many families don't live near each other anymore, and yet again, there's another gap there, isn't there, how those people access services.
Yeah, there's a really good service called the I Forget service, which is run by Age UK, Lincoln. Again, that's quite in its infancy in terms of the support that it provides, but doing some really good work in making sure that it's accessible and potentially filling gap in statutory services in terms of that support. So I would highly recommend that. So if you just Google I Forget Lincolnshire, it will pop straight up, and there's lots of helpful phone numbers and guidance on there. I hope that's helpful.
There is also LPFT host the Memory Support Service, which is contracted by Lincolnshire County Council, and that can be a self-referral, so somebody can just get in touch that way. And there are also a huge expanse now of dementia support groups right across the county, and they have guest speakers and can give carers that kind of advice. There's also Carers First, who offer direct support to carers who are struggling and can signpost them to the correct benefits, and formal support carer networks.
Thank you. I've got no one else expressed to speak. Councillor Morgan, I'll allow you to come back once.
Yeah, thank you. It's just a really quick point. I'm picking up the very valid issue around communication. We know certainly we did some research in the Grantham area. Over 20% of our residents aren't online, and I suspect the folk we're talking about are perhaps even less likely to be online. So what I think what we could do with is a better comms strategy, and I think it would be really helpful if they could share the contact details with us, because we can then get out there and spread the word across all of our districts. But I think it's very unfortunate that there seems to be quite a heavy dependency on people going online and doing the research and looking these things up, especially given the particular nature of the issues that we're talking about. So I think we need to think a bit more out of the box. I'd like to see a more proactive approach, if that's possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of self-referral, I think online is obviously a key part of that, but primary care have got a massive part to play in this as well, and we try and work really closely with our GP and other primary care partners in making sure that they're equipped with that information as well, to be able to refer people on and to make sure that they're aware of those support offers out there. But that is a constant ongoing piece of work. Again, something to be picked up through the dementia strategy. Did you want to add anything, Jackie?
Just to say, I totally recognise that, and whilst I think the older people that are starting to come through our service are much more IT savvy, there is still a cohort of people who are not online or are a bit anxious about using IT, which is one of the reasons we physically went out to a large number of dementia support groups, so that we could talk face to face, give out handouts about the service, and give updates as to what support is currently available. We've also had meetings with a lot of our stakeholders. We have our own older adult stakeholder group that consists of care providers who can then go and cascade that information themselves in person.
Okay, thank you for that. Any further? Yeah, Councillor Morgan, you want briefly?
Yes, sorry. It was actually relates to the previous point that we picked up. Can I request through you, Chair, that we specifically, one of the issues that we've identified is a gap in the crisis area. Could I request that we bring that back to committee at some point, see what progress has actually been made on that, if that's possible? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can take an update when they come back anyway from the review in November, so we'll ensure that that encapsulates part of that as well. Yep, no problem. Liz.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the presentation, Sarah and Jackie. Just a couple of things, if I may. In the feedback, which I think is a really good demonstration that you've got lots of feedback from the users, and as you've just said, Jackie, gone into different areas. I just wondered if you'd any thoughts in terms of those from the Grantham locality, given that the services have not been delivered from there. Is that something the clinical Senate might pick up in terms of more feedback in that locality? And just secondly, I think it's great that the dementia strategy is coming online, but we were aware in previous Scrutiny committees that there's a significant wait for patients waiting to be diagnosed with dementia, and I just wondered if there's any update on that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. If I pick up your latter point, Liz, and then in terms of the specific engagement in Grantham, Jackie, I know the dementia home treatment team actually do have a hub in Grantham, so it's not that the service is not well represented in that area. But yes, in terms of the where we've struggled a little bit with our memory assessment services, it's been part of our community mental health team for older adults. And as part of the NHS planning in the system for this financial year, we have been given approval to move forward with a bespoke memory assessment service, which is really great news for the population of Lincolnshire in terms of making sure that there is that dedicated capacity to make sure that we are actually assessing people as quickly as possible. So that's something that we're really excited about and have been pushing for quite a while. So Jackie, did you want to talk about specific engagement events in Grantham, please?
Yes, we have already attended a couple of local support groups, and we also did a face-to-face event in Grantham to try and sort of target that population area. Not in your report, but just this week we attended a dementia support group on London Thorpe Road at Belton Golf Club, which was attended by 40 people. So there was a really good attendance. We had 2 colleagues attend that group to discuss the dementia home treatment team. Again, overwhelming support. I think the overwhelming feedback we get is where at all possible, people would prefer to be treated in their own home. And the DHTT, as we said, are a county-wide service. So whereas before people might have to travel to Manthorpe Centre or over to Lincoln for an inpatient bed, a large section of that population can now be treated in their own home. I think the DHTT have seen around 40 people with an NG31 postcode, and those are potentially people that would have had to have travelled either to Manthorpe or to Langworth Ward. So we have really tried to target the Grantham area, but with the caveat that both Manthorpe, Langworth and the dementia home treatment team are a county-wide service. It's not just for the people of Grantham. And as Sarah rightly says, we do have a base for the dementia home treatment team in Grantham.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Lunderwatton.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the paper. Councillor Morgan has just tried to pick this up again. So my question is, on the back of hers, she beat me to it, what options are you looking at for crisis support in older dementia adults, please? Because people get in crisis, not 9 to 5, 8 to 6, a lot of them get into crisis overnight. And if I may, can you explain what step-down support is and what a virtual ward looks like in the context of these patients? Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. In terms of the crisis support, that will be something that we would need to bring back to a future meeting of the committee, because obviously we don't have funding at the minute in terms of we're not commissioned to provide that, but we will work up options on the basis of the engagement once that's completed in terms of what that looks like. As you're aware, NHS services under significant financial pressure, so the first step will have to be, well, what can we provide within the resources that we have? But I believe that there will be a financial requirement in terms of making sure that we can completely fill any identified gaps in that provision. And that will have to be through the commissioning round, as well as everything else that is requested through commissioning rounds with finite financial resources. So not able to talk in detail at the minute in terms of what that looks like. But as I said, what we would start with is there anything that we can do with our existing services in terms of, Jackie mentioned earlier, looking at the hours of operation to meet seasonal differences in demand, for example. And in terms of the virtual ward and offer, it is step up and step down services that's operated through the dementia home treatment team, and we have 4 sort of transitional workers as part of that model as well to support people as they go through the pathway. But Jackie can talk a lot more intelligently about it than I can.
I hope so. So the step down offer is we have cohorts of patients who are ready for discharge but still would require some intensive support, and the previous option would have been for those people to remain in hospital. But we know that being in their own environment is much more beneficial. So to speed up that discharge, the dementia home treatment team will offer intensive support in their own home as an ongoing part of their hospital care. We also, as Sarah rightly said, have transitional workers who support with the sort of non-medical interventions, things like anxiety management, graded programs, similar to what a social prescriber might offer. It might be taking somebody to a dementia support group for the first time and building up their confidence, supporting them back to doing their own shopping, where people become quite de-skilled when they're in hospital. So the transitional workers support with building those skills back up again. So they support the dementia home treatment team in a step down process, are sort of that low level support that is more than our community mental health team might be able to offer, but the person doesn't actually need to be physically in hospital during that process. So it might be monitoring medication changes, it might be supporting the carer to adapt as the person has come home from a stay in hospital.
Okay, thank you. I haven't got any other speakers, so I've just got 3 questions myself, and then I'm going to close down the debate. My first question is on page 50, the first bullet point. Have at any point you been close to reaching full capacity at the Langworth ward? And if so, where would these patients be sent? And finally, what future modelling has been done to ensure you can either expand capacity in the future or reinstate a second site?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Chair. So our capacity, in terms of the occupancy on Langworth ward, has been around sort of early 70 to late 70%. So we've always had that area of flex around the pathway, which is really positive. If it did come to reaching full capacity, then there is always the option to use out of area beds, but that would be a last resort. And we've used that as our sort of gauge as to whether the model is working or not in terms of the Langworth ward occupancy as well as out of area. And as I said previously, really positive that we haven't used that. In terms of our demographic modelling going forward, over the fullness of time, it does look like potentially we might need additional capacity, and that's something that we've talked about in the previous committee. So we would be looking at additional bed capacity that we've got. Manthorpe is potentially an option, but there are other options as well. So that's something that we need to pull through in terms of our modelling going forward. But with our memory assessment service, early intervention and diagnosis, of course, has much better outcomes for people. So once that service is up and running and operational, the time will be right to redo that modelling and see what the future holds with that service in place.
Okay, thank you. My next question is there any further information on the timetable for the East Midlands Clinical Senate to complete the report by September? And do you actually expect this date to be met by them?
Another great question. They have all of the relevant information. So there was obviously quite a lot of information requests that came through as part of that review. They now have all of that, and we will be holding them to account to meet the September deadline to make sure that we can come back and update the committee as soon as possible on next steps.
Okay, thank you. And my final question is the engagement feedback on page 53 refers to using digital technology via an identified carer link to mitigate the impact on carers having to travel. Can you expand on this, and how well does this work with patients with dementia?
Thank you. Jackie, did you want to pick this one up, please?
Yeah, I think generally there is an assumption that this cohort of people don't use IT, but actually we find, I think since, especially during COVID, when people had to start getting used to technology, that has changed. We have recently introduced a virtual chatbot to complete some assessments as a pilot, and have been very surprised at the number of this cohort of people that are willing to use that. We have, however, we certainly acknowledge that not everybody suits the IT offer, and it's not everything. We do print out copies. Whenever I go to events, I take printed out paper copies of the surveys that we offer. And as I say, we try and get out regularly to meet people face to face, to try and capture those people that don't like to use that technology.
Okay, thank you. In which case, I'm going to move to a proposal. I propose we thank our presenters, that we note the report on the continued pilot of dementia home treatment and extended temporary closure of Manthorpe Unit in Grantham, taking into account the continuous public engagement and involvement carried out on this service, developments to date to endorse this continued engagement approach, and to allow the independent evaluation to be completed and findings used to inform the next steps. The expected date for completion for the independent evaluation is September 24. So I suggest that we have the proposals arising from the independent review considered at our November meeting, and we will take into account, obviously, to look at the comms strategy at this point, I think, and anything else we'll pick up in the work programme. Do I have a seconder for my proposal? Thank you, Councillor Kendrick. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. That's supported unanimously. Thank you. And once again, thank you to our presenters.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll now move on to agenda item 10, the Grantham Urgent Treatment Centre, the first 6 months. Sarah, sorry. Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Councillor Barkin. So the item was circulated as part of the agenda pack on pages 59 to 68. This item provides the committee with the information on the first 6 months of the operation of the Grantham Urgent Treatment Centre, which was opened in autumn of 2023. I'd like to welcome our presenters on Teams. We have Pete Burnett, Director of Strategic Planning, Integration and Partnership for the NHS Lincolnshire Integrated Care Board, and Carl Ratcliffe, Group Operational Lead for Frailty, Stroke and Acute Services Review for Lincolnshire Community and Hospitals Group. Can I hand over to you just to have a brief walk through the paper, and we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
No, thanks, Chair. Happy to do so. So firstly, thank you for letting us join virtually. I know ideally it would be better to be in the room, but we've had meetings with NHS England today, so I appreciate that and allowing us to do this. So I'm going to give a summary of the kind of work prior to the UTC opening, then I'll hand over to Carl to talk through, from a trust perspective, the kind of the first 6 months of operational kind of delivery. So as you know, Grantham, as we termed A&E, shut in 2016 overnight. And in 2017, the Lincolnshire kind of NHS agreed to kind of review the acute services kind of configuration within the county. As part of that work, we developed a pre-consultation business case which proposed changing Grantham A&E into a 24/7 UTC, initially with booked appointments overnight, but follow early engagement ahead of any consultation. We looked to change that to an open access process. We then went out to that pre-consultation business case was approved by what was the Lincolnshire CCCG in 2021, and we consulted with the public between September and December 2021 on our proposed service changes, which there were 4 of, and 1 being the UTC. That was completed, and a decision-making business case was taken to the CCG board at the end of May, which was approved, and that led to the kind of agreement that the A&E that had been shut and was still shut temporarily overnight would transform into a 24/7 UTC. Following that period of time, we worked with partners to develop the specification, look at partly looking at the feedback, and that included members of the public in terms of specking, in terms of agreeing what that specification would look like, and the contract was then given to ULHT because they provided the kind of A&E contract, and they worked with the ICB on developing the kind of implementation plan, and the phased and agreed in a phased approach in terms of moving forward with the UTC. We also worked with NHS England during that time just to confirm kind of the operational kind of parameters of the UTC and kind of derogations that might be in place initially to allow us to open up 24/7 ahead of the winter period and specifically the Christmas period, which we know is particularly busy. Everything was in place and it was agreed that the UTC would open in October. And that's where I'll hand over to Carl to talk around the first 6 months since it's been open.
Thanks, Pete, and thanks, Chair. And I'll just walk through the details in the paper if that's okay, but do stop me if I go into too much detail. So, as you say, the unit opened on the 31st of October, so that's in a good, I think that's 7 months now, Pete, Chair, of performance within the UTC. So when the unit opened, initially that did open for the 24-hour period, but with a few exceptions. So EMAS, we started with a 12-hour period. We didn't take those conveyances overnight. We took that first month to learn and to really to ramp up the service along with the staffing. And then promptly from that sort of 4th of December, that was 1 month on, we were able to take the 24-hour ambulance conveyances, and we increased our cover using GPs and ACPs out of hours. So that was really good. And Peter, as you've already mentioned, we looked at the booked appointments and tried to increase those number of offerings ahead of, in February, then we had our system one, which is the booking system for the patients, which is predominantly a community system, and we'd been on a very different one when it was an ED. That was then in place, and all the appointments then fully bookable via 111. And again, we'd put in a request to have the road signage altered in the town. That was the last derogation, I think, Pete and Chair, with NHS England, and that was removed in February. It took quite a while to get that in place. So really, by the end of February, we had 4 derogations in place around the 111 system, the bookings, EMAS, and the signage. They were all removed. So whilst we'd started in the November, we saw the unit fully functioning as it should via the specification, Pete, at the end of February. So that's the sort of summary. In terms of the working model, within your paper, you'll see that initially we did start with a number of vacancies within nursing. We have approximately 32 nurses that are employed across the service to provide that 24-hour period. And now we are down to 1 vacancy within that team. So the recruitment to Grantham UTC, Pete, Chair, has been really successful. That's in terms of the nurses. The medical staff, again, we have a mix of consultants, and we're doing some work to bolster these in a rotation with Lincoln ED site so that we have greater security of the staffing, because obviously being a smaller functioning UTC, there's a smaller number of consultants. I think there's only 2, Pete, employed for the Grantham site. So we've put them in a rotation with Lincoln. So consultants, middle grades and junior doctors and GPs, that's our medical provision. Then obviously GPs, we've worked very closely with K2, so that's been a real success. It's been very good to have the local GPs involved both as users of the UTC, but also service provision. So initially we started, it was a real challenge. We had only about 70% of the shifts covered. The rest of those shifts we had to cover via agency, but now we're almost fully occupied in terms of those shifts. So in terms of staffing summary, we initially had some extra costs where we had to fill some of the staffing, particularly nursing, through agency shifts, and some of the medical staffs again through shifts, but through agency rather. But now we're at a point where the unit's nearly fully established and with a good stable workforce. In terms of access, initially when the unit opened, we were around 80 attendances a day, and now we're up around 110, 120. And again, I've put in the paper that we are at that upper end of the business case, but we are working with K2 because some of the patients we know come to us because the service is open, where actually the local GPs agree they would be better suited being treated within that aspect of the local care. So again, I know there was a question, Chair, around how would we and how do we deal with extra demand. I'm thinking about some of the previous questions. I put three-term actions within there that we're able to use if there are those increases in demand, Pete. One is on a short-term basis. They will always look at the staff and then decide if it's safe or if there's any risk, particularly if the weights are increased within the service. And that's looked at 4 times a day via a capacity call. Then there's a medium term where the medicine leadership team are able to agree short-term extra posts if activities increased. For example, if there's events on in the Grantham area and we know they're there, we will put extra nurse and medical shifts on. And then longer term, twice a year, there's what we call an establishment review. So that's headed up by both the group lead for nursing and the group medical director, and they will look at the area that the staff have to cover, the number of side rooms, for example, and the patient activity and what's wrong with the patients. And from that, they're able to then agree an establishment level. But that's a really good practice. It's something Dr. Dunderdale brought in. It allows us to ensure over that long-term period, we don't get increases activity without the right safe staffing. And of course, when activity increases, we're very mindful to keep an eye on our incidents, but also our complaints and our compliments. It's a way of balancing that. Are we safe with our demand? In terms of ambulance data, we are at expected thresholds in terms of the conveyances, and we knew that there would be an increase, obviously moving from 12 hours to 24. At night, it is a lot quieter, where we only see 2 or 3 ambulances. And again, one thing that we said in our paper, Pete, that we wrote is we would see at the maximum 1 or 2 patients a day. And those patients are exactly the same patients that were too sick to be treated via an ED anyway at Grantham. Those patients are conveyed elsewhere. And I think as a system in Lincolnshire, we're very used to this. For example, if you have a stroke in Lincolnshire, you go to the stroke unit at Lincoln Hospital, the same with a cardiac event. These centres of excellence for both stroke, cardiac events is well established as a national strategy around hubs and around the focusing of resources around some of these specific conditions. So really, we've not seen any conveyances via EMAS outside of what we predicted and what is keeping the patients and the public safe in Grantham. That's ambulance data. Performance, initially, the unit was below the national required standard, about 80%, but again, with increasing staffing levels and matching the staff into the demand, we've seen now performance come back to the required standard around the 95 to 97% standard. And again, looking at complaints and compliments, I think Grantham's always done very well. I think when it was a 12-hour ED, there was that question around when will we get a greater provision of service. And many of our complaints, they run through a normal process within the trust. And many of those around communication, where people, for example, will say they've got good treatment, but they would just like to have known a little bit more about what's happening to them. So I think there was only one patient during a very busy period within that 7 months, Pete and Chair, where they'd said they were concerned about their weights. But again, that was just a busy period. It wasn't that they felt that the service was unsafe. Often they're used to getting a turnaround time of 2 hours within the UTC, which is that required standard and what people should expect in Grantham. Again, you will have seen in there, and I won't read them, some really good stuff other than you can see someone said very good stuff, very pleasant, and doctor explained everything very professional. So I think in summary around the complaints and compliments, it's something that we do keep really close eye on about, and also how the staff feel, you know, in terms of the staff survey. But I think people see Grantham as a very valuable resource, and I think the UTC being a 24-hour service is working very well. Yes, it's been busy, but we are working with the GPs to bring some of that activity back into their forum, and having Dave, one of the local GPs, on board with us, both as a service provider, but Dave Baker, but also as part of that PCN network, he's able to have those conversations with his colleagues, Pete and Chair. So in summary, the derogations have all been removed now, Pete. We're performing as expected. NHS England are very pleased with our progress in terms of doing that. I think the service now has moved away from my and Pete, your overview, because we've kept we have regular meetings every month to look at where we are. It's now gone to business as normal within the division and the execs, and it will fit into that wider ASR when we start to deliver some of the ward activity and work through there and fully deliver ASR. But I think Grantham, I hope everybody does accept, has been a tremendous success, Pete. We've moved it from the 12-hour ED, where it had some challenges, and I know at that point they struggled to recruit staff. We've put in a 24-hour service, and I think it's excelled to support the public and the patients of Grantham. So that's my summary. I guess, Pete, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add in case I've missed anything, and then we're over to you, Chair, if that's okay. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got Councillor Morgan first, please.
First of all, thank you very much for that comprehensive report. Where to start? First of all, I have my own personal experience recently of going into the UTC. I actually waited about 3 hours to be seen, and I actually had a consultation with a doctor in the corridor. It was that busy. There was nowhere we could actually go in any room cubicle. So it just gives an indication actually of how busy the unit really is. I think the general feedback I'm getting as Chair of SOS Grantham Hospital is that the people are very happy, and the fact that we've got our 24/7 which has been touched on back is really important. I think it's definitely worth emphasising that Grantham is not a usual UTC. I know that the ULHT tried to change the name of it and refused, but the fact is we're not talking about GP, nurse supported unit, dealing just with minor injuries. We're talking about a unit which pretty much, and I think many people feel, is almost an A&E, but not quite. With regards to the level of service, as has been stated, Grantham A&E always had good CQC results. So I think it's great that we've managed to keep that level of service. The staffing issues that were touched on before actually were a result of decisions by ULHT moving staff away. It was never actually an issue at Grantham, but now it looks like we're recruiting back again, so I'm glad to hear that we're doing that. What I'd like to focus on is the patients who we've just touched on. Referring to them as 1 or 2 a day is a neat way of breaking down the fact that we're actually talking up to 700 emergency patients who would have been seen when Grantham was an A&E, who are now being moved and transferred elsewhere. What's concerning me is the feedback on them, because they're by definition the most acutely ill patients who would have had a relatively short journey. That feedback is not good. It widely differs from had excellent service, went to Lincoln, dashed into the heart, had heart surgery and was treated absolutely first class, to being left in corridors in Lincoln A&E. And that's also a heart bypass patient who had issues post-operative, and veteran who was actually left for in total about 36 hours in Lincoln A&E without being properly seen. So the issue really is how we're managing those. For me now, I think we've got the basics right at the UTC. I think the growth is an issue. If I'm seen in the corridor now, what's going to happen in the future? We know that it's a growth town. How actually are we going to manage that, providing more provision there? Actually, I'd suggest. How are we managing those patients who are transferred elsewhere? How are we monitoring the impact of the change in service on those? And then the other issue I'm picking up is that as recently as last week, one of our local residents rang 111 and asked to be referred, and they were told they needed to go to UTC and were offered Boston. And they had to argue with the people on the phone to say, I've got, if that's where I've got to go, we've got one in Grantham. And in the end, they ended up leaving that call, abandoning it, and then coming back again. And I think a different 111 unit picked them up. And then they were referred to Grantham. So I still think there's an issue about getting the message out via 111. And it's still not clear, I think, around which ambulances are actually stopping at the UTC. It's really good to see that they are now, that I saw the report. We are getting them stopping. But again, the UTC is supposed to be able to deal with patient stabilisation in an acute emergency. Is that actually happening? Because it isn't actually clear. Thank you.
So Carl, if I quickly go on some of that and then hand over to you, if that's okay. So thank you very much for your feedback, Councillor Morgan. I appreciate the positive feedback in the UTC, notwithstanding obviously being seen in the corridor, and that in your case isn't ideal in terms of the business in the department. In terms of, so just to pick up on a few points, then I'll hand over to Carl. The 111, but that is clearly on the directory of services that UTC is at Grantham. It's 24/7, and what level of provision it can take. And clearly from your example there, that call handler didn't follow the right routes, and when actually they called back into the 111, they were giving Grantham's an option. So we can pick that up, but that shouldn't be happening, and it's not coming across that that's happening regularly, because we're getting direct bookings through the 111 system using system 1. So clearly it is in place, but there may be some anomalies there that we can pick up on in that one. In terms of stabilisation, the A&E or the UTC before they go to an A&E, that is in place, but the aim isn't to utilise that, because actually the aim is to take the patient to where they need to be treated in the best possible care by the right clinical teams. So actually, if someone turns up at the Grantham UTC and needs to be stabilised, because actually they need onward treatment, that can happen. But the key is, hopefully, if they're that unwell, they'd have phoned 999 and they would have taken them to the right centre with the right level of care and clinical kind of support them. And that moves into the final question before I hand over to Carl, is around those patients that are taken from the Grantham area to other centres. This isn't new, so this has been in place since 2008. And if you've had a heart attack, stroke since 2008, and any other kind of acutely ill kind of episode, you've already been transferred to other centres. So it's not a new change to the kind of ambulance kind of provision and kind of pathways we have in place. What has changed, and this, as well as us in terms of making it a UTC, there's also national kind of requirements on respiratory services, and the key 1 to 2 a day are largely those respiratory patients that need to be seen in the centre with the kind of specialist care and the kind of and the background services that a type 1 A&E does need, and that's why they go there. Clearly, A&Es up and down the country are under pressure, and that's not dissimilar. We're not here to represent or talk about Lincoln and Boston in that sense, because it's not really our expertise. But if they are there and they are busy, then that will cause some issues going into them. It's great that they've gone into the cardiac centre. That's good. No doubt if they're going into a very busy ED, there may be delays that they then have when they arrive in that sense. But it's still the right place for them to go, because actually the key is getting the right clinical care, the right level of expertise to care for that patient, and that's why they are taken to those areas, because that isn't found at Grantham. But Carl, I'm not sure there's anything else you want to put forward.
I guess, and apologies if I double back over anything, and Councillor Charmaine, if I miss anything, please come back. So I'll try and deal with some of the things. I think the first bit is, as Pete said, also thank you for your feedback around the really good things that are happening. What I would say, I'd encourage both yourself and other people that you talk to where they've had less than ideal experiences, because we don't want those, is to feedback to us through appropriate channels. So write into us, whether you want to write to Pete or I, and we'll pass them on. But I think that's the first thing, is let's capture any feedback, Pete and Charmaine, so that we can do that. In terms of weights, I think, Pete, we were very clear in the business cases. We got towards the upper end. We know that we need more space, Councillor Charmaine, so I do agree with you. It shouldn't have been seen in the corridor, and I do apologise. What we're working on is some of the areas adjacent to ED, we need to take those over, the UTC element rather, and take those over and give greater space. So I do agree, you shouldn't be seen in a corridor, but we knew, Pete, that would be an issue as activity increased. As I said, we are working with Dr. Baker, one of the local GPs, to move some of the activity out because he's really clear those patients should be seen by the GPs. I think in terms of conveyances, and Pete, I agree with you. I think it's been a long time since Grantham was able to take and fully treat people that were beyond a level that that would be safe at Grantham. What Grantham can do is if you walk in and you're having a heart attack and your heart was to stop, for example, Grantham's role is to stabilise you and transfer you onwardly promptly. So if, to give assurance to the councillors, if a patient did walk in, Grantham has that ability. But if EMAS picked you up having a heart attack, they would not take you to Grantham. They would take you to Lincoln. So I think it's been a long time. You need quite a lot of what we call adjunct services to be able to treat people that are profoundly unwell. And Grantham doesn't have the space, the technology, or the resource for those. And I don't think there's a need. And also nationally, we've seen a lot of these really important services centralised. So it's happened in London, not just in Lincolnshire, where they've centralised those. I think, Pete, you've spoken about 111 because that shouldn't happen. Grantham should be signpost, shouldn't it? So I think, and again, I'm sorry, I know, again, talking about Lincoln, we know that Lincoln and Boston are under pressure, as many EDs in the countries are, but I also lead on a big piece of work, which you'll be aware of, Pete, and I hope the councillors are, around frailty. What we're trying to do, and this is part of the plan for Grantham, is to move some of those patients that end up in our EDs that are frail and over 65 and try to support them in the community, whether it's in some of our new hubs that we'll be developing in the community hospitals. So really, Councillor Charmaine, I agree with you, Lincoln and Boston are challenged, but what we're trying to do about that is to move some of that care closer to home, as I think the previous people presented from LPFT, Pete, on supporting, keeping patients that are really troubled, but potentially don't need to be in our hospitals. One of the things when you're frail and over 65, it's not great for you to be in our hospitals. It's about how we can support them. So that's what we're doing about trying to address that issue. It is going to take a little bit of time because it's quite a change, almost reversing how we treat our patients. So, Councillor Charmaine, I hope between Pete and I, we've answered many of your questions because I think they're really good ones. So, Chair, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll allow you to come back very briefly because I've got 3 other speakers and I'm acutely aware of the time.
Yeah, thank you. It was really just a point of clarification that we did a Freedom of Information request in 2018, not 2008. And actually, the majority of cases you'd expect to be dealt with at an A&E were being dealt with at Grantham. It's true that there were certain heart conditions, for example, and stroke that were referred elsewhere, but I just wanted to make that point of clarification. And there is actually still quite a lot of expertise within the hospital. Thank you.
Pete, did you want to come back on that at all, or should we just move on to the next one?
Well, I can do. I don't want to get into a back and forth, but there's clearly 2 national reports that say that that's not the case. So I think the Freedom of Information Act to do with news scores. So that's how the patient kind of how ill they were, and that showed that there was some acutely ill people there. But it's clear since 2008, an independent reconfiguration panel and the East Midlands Clinical Senate review into the ED, or as it was an ED, both articulate that it hasn't taken a full set of patients since 2008, and there has been kind of derogations in place and patients transferred elsewhere. So it's not for me, they're a matter of record, public record, and independently carried out. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Councillor Burke.
Thank you, Chair. I'm grateful to Charmaine for mentioning a veteran waiting 36 hours in Lincoln, which is frankly appalling, and I think yeah, but I'm assuming that's an elderly person, and it's just anybody, as you rightly say, waiting that period of time. So my question is this a consequence of services not being available in Grantham?
I can't, without knowing the individual patient, neither me or Carl can really respond to that, and they can't respond really to the wait in Lincoln County because it's not our kind of area of responsibility in that sense. But I'm not sure, Carl, if you've got anything else to add.
I think the way is one that isn't acceptable. I do agree, but I think that's why I said there's a big piece of improvement work across Lincoln and Boston, less so required at Grantham, because I think Grantham's performance is really good, councillors. And that improvement work is how we can deal with the here and now, because those waits aren't acceptable. But that's the whole bit behind me being seconded out of my medicine managing director post for a year, is to try and work on this frailty programme, because that's where we need to be, is how can we bring a third of our frail elderly patients better care. And better care is not being 36 hours in our EDPs. We all agree on that. So, but this is a challenge which isn't, I don't think it's because of the Grantham consequence. We've talked already about one or two conveyances that go to Lincoln or Boston, and that's a very low demand against some EDs that were built for probably half the number of patients we're treating, hence the big build projects that are both undergoing at Lincoln and Boston Hospital. Thanks, Pete. Chair, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Martin, please.
Thank you, Chairman. You've mentioned several times about what I would call the customer journey, where the patient has arrived at the UTC. How do we actually track where the patient has initially come from? Could they have actually used a GP line? Is it they haven't managed to get through and they have come direct to UTC? Or is it they've just got used to not using a GP at all? I was just wondering how those statistics are gathered. Do we actually question patients as they arrive? And with that data, obviously opening hours of GP availability would impact that. Who would analyse all this? Because obviously the patient journey into the UTC is just as important as what happens to them afterwards. Thank you.
Shall I answer some of that, Pete? Is that okay? I think I would say, being very honest, 50-50. We do patient audits, so we talk to patients and say, you know, how have you arrived here today? How have you made this choice? And we'll do that either when they arrive or after. We'll phone them up and say, can we talk to you about your experiences? What was it like? How did you get to us? Many patients won't phone the GP. And I think some of that will be because obviously there is that real importance within Grantham that the UTC is used. So people will message and say, use it rather than going to your GP. That sometimes then places undue pressure on the unit where patients should be signalled to use their GP for appropriately. So we have done some education work with patients in the area, but also the GPs. So we get very few GP sent patients where they will refer patients up to us. That's normal practice, I think, Chair. The issue will be, I think patients just present to us, but that's an ongoing challenge. And I think that will improve. That's what we've been doing with Dr. Baker, is how do we signpost to patients? And again, using 111 is a really good way of how do you pick the right provider? So I think it's a mix of patients choosing, but also sometimes people in the local area say, go and use Grantham rather than use the right resource. And that's what we need to correct. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Wotton, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the paper. Very interesting, very positive things. I just want to vouch for what Councillor Morgan said. I think we've become a partnership today because I support a lady who lives on her own. She's got health issues. She has a care team that comes in, and I got a call from our care team because they're not allowed to take patients to hospital, and they asked me on the back of their 111 message to take her to Boston UTC. And obviously I told them the error of their ways. Why would I want to travel all that far with a patient in distress when we've got a UTC down the road? So I tootled off to the UTC, and the lady was seen and treated there, and because she lives on her own and vulnerable, she was actually kept in and she was looked after very well. So that's backs up what Councillor Morgan said. But also, unfortunately, I did my own little bit of market research, and I very sillily tripped over an electrical cable and broke my thumb. So therefore, I popped down the road to UTC, supported by a friend, and it was very busy. But I was seen and treated and in and out within the 4-hour limit. So that's really good. And also, I watch the next door feeds and everything is positive. They talk about Grantham Hospital, the good service they've had, how they were supported by the staff, how friendly the staff are. So I just wanted to give you that feedback. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, I was going to say thank you, Councillor Wilson. That's very encouraging in terms of that. We will pick up the 111 point with through our UTC colleagues, so they can take it back. We do know it's in there, but clearly there is some practice that is taking place where they are sending you elsewhere, which is inappropriate and totally not needed. So we'll pick that one up with our UEC colleagues.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Mackinson Saunders now, please.
Thank you. I was just interested to see the increase in the number of patients, up 45%, which was a huge amount, and it just shows the values of our UTCs around Lincolnshire. And going back to section 106 is how sad that the GPs aren't really fulfilling what we would hope GPs would fulfil. They can get the money. UTCs would be a much better place of putting it. But I was just taken with how much what a huge increase there was, and I wondered if anybody could explain why there should be. I find them a lot more helpful, and receptionists are a lot easier to deal with, and I'm sure a lot of people feel that. But I'm just going to fly the flag for Louth UTC, and I know it's coming up later in the year, but they're really good services for our residents. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's great. I think the successful services do people will attend them, which is good to see. But I think if you look nationally up and down the emergency and urgent care pathway, there's been significant increases both to emergency departments and UTCs, not just in Lincolnshire but in all the county or across the country. And there's a lot of work nationally going on to what is driving that, because I think May was one of the busiest months in emergency and urgent care the country's ever had, which you wouldn't normally expect in a more kind of warmer. We can take the British weather as warmer in May in a warmer month. So I think there is some national work going what is driving that position. And we do look at this locally as well in terms of how can we do that. And there's schemes like Pharmacy First coming in, 111, the 111 option 2 around mental health coming in and that kind of stuff. But I don't know the specifics in terms of Grantham. One of the key things is obviously it's still within the limits of the business case, but it is up the upper end. But if you compare it to Lincoln County of Boston, they've also seen significant increase in their activity as well. But Carl, I'm not sure from your perspective if there's anything else you want to add.
I think I agree, and I think I would also agree how great Louth is. I have relatives that visit occasionally from London, and they can't get over how fantastic a services that you can go, like we have at Grantham, turn up at a booked appointment. So I think thank you for sort of mentioning Louth, because it's a great service. I think, Pete, you're right. All these areas are busier than normal, and I think one thing we can say about Grantham is we have an ability to deal with those patients. So whilst we are at the upper end and we need a bit more space, I would rather be in Grantham UTC unless I was very unwell, for example, with a stroke or heart attack, than being Lincoln. So I think Grantham does very well. It's a great hospital and I really support it. Its strength. I think there is a bit of work to do, Pete, with the local population around some of the frail services. For example, one of the councillors mentioned that frail lady. Actually, can we treat her in our own home with our urgent rapid response services? So I think that's what I want to bring to Grantham, is even better care. And we need to remove from our mindset that better care is always in hospital care. It's about care in the right place, and how do we support people to be safe, cared for and loved at home, Pete. So it's a bit more of a speech about what I'm very passionate about for Grantham.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to move. I've got 2 questions, if I might, and then I'm going to close down the debate. So my first question is, the report states that the level of activity is at the upper end of modelling presented in the business case. Do you expect the level of activity to exceed the modelling, and how will you manage the extra demand moving forwards?
What's answers from Carl?
So, again, do I expect it? Again, it's one of those crystal balls. I think we deal with that if it happens. So what we are looking at is, are the patients that we can take out? We know that there are patients that, as Dr. Baker has said, one of the local GPs should be seen. But I think what we do is, if activity goes up, we know we need more space. Pete, we did say that in the business cases, and we have to adjust the staffing. So I think we're a long way away. Even if the activity doubled, we'd still have an ability to deal with it. We just need more staff. So I think we can keep safe. I think the national trend, Pete, is it's got busier and busier, but hopefully some of the other services that we want to bring online at Grantham will take some of these patients out of our UTCs, not those people that have broken a finger, as somebody did, somebody mentioned earlier, but some of the other patients, the elderly patients, we can move to our SDECA that we've got planned for frailty, and our additional ward that we'll be putting in soon that will support some of these patients. So I think activity could go up, as it is. We're seeing that nationally, Pete, but we do have some other mechanisms. And I say, I do have to state, care isn't always best about being in a UTC or an inpatient. We're trying other solutions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And my next question is, the report on page 67 refers to a body called the Grantham Review Meeting, working on refinements to the services at the UTC. Can you expand on the phrase refinements to the service? Would this ever mean reductions in the range of services offered?
Shall I comment, Pete? Because that's more operational. So, no, it wouldn't be about reductions in service, because I'm sure Pete would be straight on the phone, and he's already spoken to me about things where we say, right, we want to have a talk about them. They're not about that. What they are about is balancing that really important, who are the patients turning on, have we got the right staff to keep them safe? So normally it will mean about adding services on, Pete, won't it? It won't be about any reduction. So, but what we do, again, as I would encourage all of you that use the service, both that think it's great, but also that have had less than great experiences, please feed back to us, because that feedback, not just in this meeting, but live when it happens to you, helps us shape the service. So as we do with every service that's operational, I ran medicine for 2 years, is we take all of those comments along with activity and the money that Pete gives me, and we make sure that we've got a service fit for purpose. So we're only doing what is normal, but the service has taken away the responsibility of delivering ASR. That's in place, Pete, has been for 7 months, to what I call business as normal. So this is a normal process. Pete would stop us straight away, because he's commissioned this service, from saying we're going to reduce something, unless we could demonstrate an inability to deal with something and keep patients safe. That would require a different discussion, Pete, then, wouldn't it, if we felt we were unsafe? Okay, hope that's answered the question.
It did, thank you very much. In which case, I'm going to move to the proposal that our presenters be thanked for their report and presentation on the Grantham Urgent Treatment Centre, and the positive feedback be welcomed, and that future updates on the Grantham Urgent Treatment Centre be incorporated into reports on urgent and emergency care as part of the overview of the urgent treatment centres in those reports. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Wotton, thank you. All those in favour, please raise. Thank you. That's supported unanimously. We'll now move on to agenda item 11, work programme. Simon.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Just to ask the committee to look briefly at pages 70 onwards, 71, etc. There's a fairly full programme for the meetings in the autumn, September onwards. But just a reminder that today was an exception. We are planning to revert back to the 10 a.m. starts in future. That was just due to availability of people for this morning's meeting. In the earlier item on the Manthorpe dementia team, I've put that currently down for October on the basis of the optimism. Is that the right word? Yes, that the report will be ready, but it could be more November, as I think as was stated in the item. I say no other changes to report at this stage. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Any other comments? No. So I take it we're happy with the work programme. Councillor Morgan.
It's just confirming, because it wasn't in the summary regarding the dementia home changes, that we will be looking at the crisis, whether it needs to be looked at separately or whether that will be built in there. Because they gave us, I thought it was interesting, it wasn't until we pushed that basically it emerged that actually they're not actually commissioned to deliver it yet at all. So for me, alarm bells rang when I heard that. So I don't know what other people think, but whether it's worth pursuing on its own.
I'll bring Simon in, but in fairness, we do get regular LPFT updates, and I'm sure that we can build into that anyway. But Simon? Yes, taken on board, thank you. Any other comments? No, in which case I take it we're all happy with the work programme moving forwards. And I will bring the meeting to a close and thank you all very much for your participation. And it's been a very good meeting, so thank you. Close.